Chapter 1078. By the time Hua Xingyang arrived at the Golden Autumn Pavilion, there was already a faint light in the sky. He carried 2 portions of breakfast, shook off the snow on his body and laughed heartily. "President, these are freshly cooked buns. Do you want to try them?" Li Huaqing smiled and nodded. He put down the internal reference document in his hand and went to the dining room. Hua Xingyang hurriedly poured some vinegar and began to make soup. His movements were natural. Li Huaqing smiled as he watched Hua Xingyang busy himself. "Are you in a good mood?" "I like snow." Hua Xingyang laughed and said, "Every time it snows, it reminds me of my hometown. I haven't been back for many years. Some time ago, someone from my hometown came to visit me and gave me 2 ginseng. I made 2 bottles of wine. I'll bring you a bottle later." Li Huaqing nodded and took a bite of the bun. It was different from Qin Fangqing and Guo Wentian of the Prince Group. He was also different from Wan Qingyun and Ji Wenjiang of the Southeast Group. The relationship between Li Huaqing and Hua Xingyang was even different from that between Dongqing Wudi and Zhou Mulin in the Giant Group. In front of Li Huaqing, Zhuang Huayang's carefree attitude always carried a clear hint of respect and deference, which included deep gratitude, admiration, awe, and intimacy. The leaders of the other corporations might have different positions, but they treated each other equally. Only Hua Xingyang was like a subordinate in front of Li Huaqing. In fact, the 2 of them had a clear relationship of superior and subordinate in their political careers. When Li Huaqing was the governor of Liaodong, Hua Xingyang was the deputy governor. When Li Huaqing was the speaker of Liaodong, Hua Xingyang was the deputy speaker. After entering Yuzhou, Li Huaqing was the vice president, and Hua Xingyang was transferred to the Ministry of Personnel as the second leader. 5 years later, Li Huaqing successfully ascended to the top, and Hua Xingyang entered the parliament and became the minister of the Ministry of Personnel of Zhongzhou State. When Li Huaqing was re-elected for the second time, Hua Xingyang entered the cabinet and became the second prime minister until now. The academics was the youngest group in Zhongzhou State except for the Special Warfare Group. Unlike the Special Warfare Group, which had an inherently flawed structure, their structure was extremely rigorous and complete. They grew from a large regional group to a ruling group that influenced the entire Zhongzhou State. Any word could be used without reservation to describe Li Huaqing, and it was no exaggeration at all. His contributions were undeniable, and he was a man of great talent and bold vision. Li Huaqing completely deserved such an evaluation. The development trajectory of the academic faction was almost the same as Li Huaqing's rise. The entire academic faction was almost carried on his shoulders by his own strength and continued to grow. His ideals influenced everyone in the academics, which made the entire academics the most energetic group among the 6 major groups. It was full of vitality. However, the short rise time also meant that the academics had shortcomings in all aspects. For example, it did not have a close enough relationship with many retired but influential old people, which was a huge disadvantage that the academics had not been able to reverse so far. Another example was that there was not enough talent reserve in too short a time, let alone a perfect promotion framework, which the academics had not completely perfected so far. When the academics transferred by Qin Qin, who was born in the Giant Group, to its backyard, Liaodong, to serve as the speaker, it was a second move that Li Huaqing planned to perfect the promotion framework of the academics. Bai Qin Qin had outstanding ability and connections, and there was no need to doubt the strength of the Giant Group. The 2 groups could cooperate at the beginning, and the academics just wanted to use Bai Qin Qin to get the support of the Giant Group. In their original plan in this election, they wanted to push Bai Qin Qin to the position of a member of parliament of Zhongzhou State and promote in Liaodong province. In the next few years they would work hard to stabilize this concept so that Liaodong could get a political status similar to Wuyue, Nanyue, Beijiang, or Huading, the north, the southwest, and Yuzhou. Simply put, it was to make it a practice for the speaker of Liaodong to enter the parliament, so as to completely perfect their promotion framework. This was the goal that any group had to work hard to perfect. The so-called promotion framework, to put it bluntly, was a stable internal promotion path from an ordinary staff member to a member of parliament of Zhongzhou State. This also guaranteed that in every election at least one member of the group would be in their own hands. His position was completely in the hands of the group, it was decided internally and other groups could not take action. Only by establishing this position could the people in this position be guaranteed to be promoted when the group encountered a major crisis, and then ensure that the voice of the group in the top class of Zhongzhou State could be heard by others. Among the 6, only the academics did not have such a position at present. The Prince Group's southwest city was held by a member of parliament, and other groups could not intervene. In addition to the southwest, the Prince Group also owned Beijiang. The southeast group was even more excessive before. It held Beihai, Huading, and Wuyue, and the leaders of these three places were bound to be members of parliament. Wuyue had fallen more than a decade ago, and Wuyue was now controlled by Wang Qinglei. Even so, Beihai still had Beihai province as the top of its promotion framework. The declining North Group also had Northern City in its hands. The giant group had Yuzhou and several fixed positions in the army headquarters. Even the new group had already locked in Nanyue. Only the academics' efforts in this regard in recent years had hit a wall everywhere. All the major groups were quietly squeezing the development space of the academics. Li Huaqing's initial goal was Jiangshan and Beijiang province, which seemed to be in harmony with the Prince Group but was actually alienated. However, Jiangshan's mind was deep and unpredictable, and he had never expressed his position directly. After a few years, the academics set their eyes on Tibet. However, the situation in Tibet was complicated, and it was also difficult to be the backyard of the academics for a long time. After 10 years of games, the academics could only choose the place where it started, Liaodong. 5 years ago, Bai Qingqian was transferred to Liaodong, and then the council made a lot of big moves that were beneficial to Liaodong. A large amount of funds poured into the northeast, and Liaodong changed with each passing day. If it were not for the sudden rise of the new group, Bai Qingqian was likely to be elected as a member of parliament of Zhongzhou state in this election, and the promotion framework of the academics would have taken shape. And it would take the following time to stabilize. However, Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace broke the plan of the academics, and Li Huaqing's plan was undoubtedly ruined again. Fortunately, he would continue to be re-elected after this election, and there were still 5 years to operate. Otherwise, once he retired, although Hua Xingyang was still in power, it was really difficult for him to come up with a good solution in 5 years. At that time, the future of the academics was really a little worrying. All kinds of disadvantages always gave the emerging group the impression that although the academics was very powerful, it always lacked something. Until now, their structure was not perfect, and it could be imagined how difficult it was for Li Huaqing to rise in the beginning. Under such circumstances, it could be said that Hua Xingyang was forced by Li Huaqing to make an exception and promote him. For Hua Xingyang himself, Li Huaqing had an incomparable position in his heart. He was like a brother, a mentor, a guide, and even a father-like role. Although the age difference between the two was less than 10 years. From the original Liaodong to the current Hidden Dragon Sea, no matter where Hua Xingyang was, he always regarded Li Huaqing as the most respected leader. He regarded Li Huaqing as the most respectable leader, and he was always respectful. Last night the Prime Minister talked to me about his idea. Li Huaqing ate a bun and said slowly, for him, the situation is now out of control, and he is ready to accept the current situation. Hua Xingyang looked at Li Huaqing in surprise. Accept the current situation? He was not familiar with Li Tianlan, but now the whole world knew Li Tianlan's character. How sensitive the election of Zhongzhou state was, and how crucial the emergence of the new group was, had now become the focus of attention of all countries in the world. Under such circumstances, Qin Fangqing was ready to accept the situation, which meant that he accepted death, and it was not only his death. Li Huaqing saw Hua Xingyang's surprised look, and he was also a little surprised. You don't know? Hua Xingyang shook his head in confusion and said with a smile, although the Prime Minister doesn't have many chances now, there is always room for struggle. At the very least, he should be able to negotiate terms. Judging from his past behavior, he shouldn't give up so easily. Simple giving up, Li Huaqing murmured to himself and then shook his head. It's not simple at all. He held the bun and it was a little tasteless. From a personal point of view, Qin Fangqing did have the possibility to struggle, but from the overall situation, accepting this outcome was the most stable way. Qin Fangqing's giving up was not simple, not at all. He thought silently and suddenly asked, didn't he tell you his plan last night? He and Guo Wenyan have reached a consensus, and the Prince Group has decided to fully support you in controlling the cabinet. What did you talk about last night? Hua Xingyang's hand holding the soybean milk suddenly froze in place. His expression completely froze in an instant. His thoughts seemed to go back to a few hours ago. At that time he was practicing handwriting in his office. And Qin Fangqing was standing outside wanting to meet him. How did he get the secretary to respond? There was a clear trace of embarrassment on Hua Xingyang's face. He finally realized that something was wrong. What's wrong? Li Huaqing looked at him and asked. He received the news last night that Qin Fangqing went to see Hua Xingyang, but at that time, Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai were still there. Li Huaqing had no time to care about the conversation over there and subconsciously ignored the question. Didn't he go to see you last night? What did you talk about? Li Huaqing asked again. Hua Xingyang opened his mouth and finally couldn't help but smile bitterly. I didn't see him last night. Silence. Li Huaqing was completely silent. He looked at Hua Xingyang and didn't speak for a long time. He knew what kind of person Hua Xingyang was, so he didn't need to ask the reason to know why Hua Xingyang didn't want to see him. Chen Fangqing didn't appear in the Hidden Dragon Sea until morning, which meant that after not seeing Hua Xingyang, Chen Fangqing went to see someone else. Who else could he find? The cabinet was now the top structure, with 1 prime minister, 1 deputy prime minister and 3 deputy prime ministers. After this election, Chen Fangqing would not stay, and 2 of the 3 deputy prime ministers would also retire. Hua Xingyang didn't see Chen Fangqing, so there was only one person Chen Fangqing had to see. Deputy Prime Minister Wu Jingmin. Li Huaqing put down the steamed bun in his hand and said softly, "Did he go to Jingmin's place last night?" Hua Xingyang also thought of this problem. His face changed and he looked a little embarrassed. "Xingyang, don't be silly." Li Huaqing shook his head in disappointment. "No matter what, there will always be a boundary between you and him, but why?" He shook his head halfway and said, "What are you worried about?" Hua Xingyang became more and more embarrassed, and he didn't say anything. After a long silence, his face suddenly changed slightly and he said softly, "President, he went to see Deputy Prime Minister Wu Jingmin." "Is it you?" Li Huaqing shook his head slightly. "Don't worry about this. He's a little old. In this election he already has the support of the new group, so he won't be a threat to you. The Prime Minister won't choose to support him, and he doesn't have that position. However, I believe that since they have met, there must be some meaning to this meeting. I'm not worried about Deputy Prime Minister Wu," Hua Xingyang said with a wry smile. Li Huaqing still looked calm and he said quietly, "If he chooses to support Wen Xiyuan, then he should go to Wang Qingyun, Ji Wenxiang or Yi Dongxing. He shouldn't go to Wu Jingmin." Hua Xingyang thought about it and his face softened a little. He took a sip of soy milk, hesitated and said softly, "Should I go to visit him now?" Li Huaqing glanced at him and nodded. "You have to go, but now?" He shook his head. "He should be resting now. You can go and have a look in the afternoon. You don't have to explain anything, just go there." Hua Xingyang was a little relieved and he nodded with a smile. In the blue flower hall that the two of them couldn't see, Chen Fangqing didn't rest, but he didn't work either. He didn't return to his office. Instead, he went to the backyard of the blue flower hall and sat down on his bed. He just sat there, silent, and through the opened curtains he stared blankly at the hazy light outside the window. He began to recall his life, which had lasted for 71 years. He was born in a family that wasn't very prominent. He was from the north, but he grew up in the south. When he was born, his father was the deputy director of a small county in the south. It wasn't a big position, but he still had some power in his hands. Therefore, Chen Fangqing's childhood was very stable. He didn't wander from place to place, had no hardships and had never been bullied. When he was a teenager, his father, who was very ambitious but also tried his best to protect the family, became the director of that small county. His rank was from the deputy section to the deputy director. Chen Fangqing walked out of the county and was admitted to the best middle school in their city with his own grades. At that time and age, a father of a deputy county was obviously not a status worth showing off in the eyes of an inexperienced teenager. Chen Fangqing didn't show off, nor did he seem to be rebellious. Until now, he still felt that he was most fortunate to have met the best and most understanding teachers in middle school, so that he always had excellent grades in the 3 years of middle school. When he was in high school, Chen Fangqing's father was transferred from the county to the city as the deputy mayor and barely became a director of the city. It seemed like a promotion, but in fact, it was the result of a compromise after losing the competition. Chen Fangqing was admitted to the best high school in their province and left the city. His parents took out all their savings and bought a house in that city, which was ridiculously expensive because of education. His mother also moved there just to take care of him in school. He learned to grow. His father's career didn't make any progress in high school. When he graduated from high school, he was admitted to one of the best universities in Zhongzhou at that time with excellent grades. At that time, his father was in a semi-retired state because of a serious liver disease. In his memory, his father's face was weathered and his sideburns were white. He spent most of his life in an official career. Chen Fangqing seemed to have never seen him in high spirits. All he saw was his father's increasingly haggard body and his stooped body. Chen Fangqing was 19 years old that year. On the day he got the university admission notice, Chen Fangqing swore in his heart that after graduation, he would buy a house for his parents in Beihai and let them live in the best environment. He applied to Beihai University in Zhongzhou. Yes, Beihai University. The Wang family of Beihai. Beihai of Beihai Province. Perhaps because of his father's influence, Chen Fangqing had decided on his future path since he was in high school. He wanted to follow his father's path and reach a high position. He wanted to use his own thoughts to change many people and many things. So he chose Beihai University. This was one of the best universities in Zhongzhou State. It might not be as popular as Huaqing University and Yuzhou University, but in the international ranking, Yuzhou University was slightly higher than Beihai University. But in the field of politics, even in the whole Zhongzhou State, no university could beat Beihai University. The philosophy of Beihai University focused on ideas, humanities and politics. In the more than 500 years since the founding of Zhongzhou State, Beihai University had produced 3 presidents of Zhongzhou State, 11 prime ministers of Zhongzhou State, more than 20 vice ministers of Zhongzhou State, and hundreds of Zhongzhou State parliamentarians. This was a prominent university, a university that influenced the political trend of the whole Zhongzhou State. It was known as the Oxford of the East. The current directors of Zhongzhou State, Dongqing Wudi, Hua Jingyang, Wan Qingyun, and Bai Qingqian, who was about to become a parliamentarian, all graduated from Beihai University. Many years ago, it was Chen Fangqing's dream school. He entered Beihai as he wished and successfully completed the examination for civil servants of Beihai. The civil servants of Beihai had the best welfare in the world. Every civil servant would be assigned a house of at least 80 square meters in Beihai. But Chen Fangqing finally chose to return to his hometown. His parents refused Chen Fangqing's request to settle down in Beihai. In his father's words, Beihai was good, but home was better. That was the first time he passed by Beihai. He entered the municipal government under his father's recommendation, served as a secretary in the county, went to the provincial government, and then was transferred to Qinzhou, where he met Wu Jingmin. Chen Fangqing was 30 years old that year. At the age of 32, his father died of illness. 3 years later, he was met by Li Honghe in person and sent an invitation. He received invitations from the Giant Group, the Prince Group, and the Southeast Group. In the face of the city he was in charge of, he made a choice that he didn't know if he should regret or not. That was the second time he passed by Beihai. Then it was a meteoric rise, a meteoric rise. Councillor of Qinzhou Province. Councillor of Talent Province. Deputy Speaker. Governor of Tianfu Province. Mayor of Sinan City. Councillor of Zhongzhou State. Speaker of Sinan City. Deputy Prime Minister of Zhongzhou State. Prime Minister of Zhongzhou State. He sang all the way. But he still didn't feel that kind of high-spirited feeling. Others had seen him working himself to the bone along the way, but he only felt that he was being cautious. He used his power and resources carefully to plan his hometown, the city he was in charge of, the province he controlled, and the country he represented. He was cautious like walking on thin ice. 71 years of life had come to this day. Scenes flashed in front of him very clearly. Chen Fangqing sat on the bed in a daze, looking out of the window at the sky without the morning sun. The snowflakes all over the sky were dancing in the sky with cold, messy and beautiful. It was quiet. Just like every day in the past many years. He asked about his yesterday. Then he asked about his life. The first question. He felt that he had a clear conscience. He couldn't answer the second question. His heart might be extremely calm, but as he said to Wu Jingmin, whether it was merits or demerits, only future generations could judge. Chen Fangqing stood up slowly. He drew the curtains to cover the flying snow outside the window. He took a shower casually, changed out of his pajamas, slowly lay on the bed and closed his eyes. The headache had been relieved and he didn't need to toss and turn. Soon Chen Fangqing fell asleep. The world in the dream was a sunset. Chen Fangqing, who seemed to be many years younger, felt that he was standing by the lake of the hidden dragon sea and looking at the west. The splendid glow filled the world. The setting sun, which was slowly sinking in the sea of clouds, seemed to be melting bit by bit. The blood of the sun permeated the sea of clouds and the sky, turning it into an incomparably magnificent blood red. The blood red quietly occupied all the fields of vision. Finally, it turned into a pair of eyes. A pair of eyes occupied the sky in the dream and covered the sea of clouds. A pair of eyes that were cold and quiet, but extremely majestic. Those eyes were bright and calm. She looked down at the earth and the hidden dragon sea, reflecting the magnificent scene of the whole world, beautiful like a dream. Looking at those eyes, Qin Fangqing was suddenly filled with fear. His consciousness was torn apart by fear, and his complete consciousness was torn to pieces in an instant. Messy thoughts danced randomly in the dream where darkness and light intertwined. Some of them were warm, some were even scorching. The hot feeling boiled at the highest point of his consciousness. Like a speech without much warmth, it slowly slid down to the unknown. The dream was completely broken. Darkness occupied everything. In the front direction, there was a cliff of tens of thousands of feet and an endless abyss. Qin Fangqing suddenly opened his eyes. Everything familiar in the bedroom did not appear in his sight. There was darkness and nothingness in his sight. The seemingly endless darkness and nothingness filled the bedroom and filled the world. It was quiet and silent. Qin Fangqing opened his eyes quietly. The darkness and nothingness were getting closer and closer to him, like a piece of gauze, covering his body. It was also like the endless floating dust had found a home, accumulating more and more on his body. The darkness fell completely. Qin Fangqing, who was motionless, looked ahead quietly. The darkness that fell completely surged and finally drowned his body in the seemingly endless darkness and nothingness. Until eternity. Chapter 1079. Li Tianlan was still busy when the phone rang in a hurry. In the early morning of Yuzhou, the wind and snow danced wildly. It was as warm as spring in the luxurious suite of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Spring was in full bloom in every corner. Li Tianlan had been busy and his day was rich. For some reason, Li Tianlan did not choose to live in the Bai family after coming to Yuzhou. He just called Dongqing Wudi, Bai Zhanfeng, and Wu Jingmin respectively, and then booked a room in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the night when he returned to the hotel from the Hidden Dragon Sea. He simply had a midnight snack with Qin Weibai and took a shower. It was nearly 4 o'clock. The battle, or one-sided conquest, began in the bathroom. The water in the bathroom splashed out of the fish tank, and 2 delicate fingerprints were left on the bathroom mirror full of steam. The torn bathrobe was thrown out of the bathroom and the water drops on the sofa rolled slightly. Li Tianlan gently put on high heels for Qin Weibai. The crystal lamp in the living room was soft and hazy. A faint fragrance floated. In Li Tianlan's sight was the delicate, cold and perfect face without any flaws. However, this face that he could not get enough of was obviously flushed at this time. Her eyes were blurred, and her red lips were slightly open. With some rapid breathing, there was a kind of almost fatal charm and temptation in the ethereal coldness. It was a kind of enchanting and soul-stirring after the extreme bloom. Her character made her try to maintain a reserved image after she calmed down a little. But when she saw Li Tianlan put on high heels for her with a serious face, her face became redder. Her legs were a little weak and she was pulled into the bedroom by Li Tianlan. Her soft legs and slender high heels stepped on the floor like clouds and cotton. The bedroom echoed with a soft song that was enough to make anyone crazy. It was soft, sweet and greasy. The voice was like melted cold water, with a little reserve and delicate, melodious. Li Tianlan felt like a tiger chasing a butterfly, and every time he had a desire to eat the goddess under him. It was no exaggeration to say that Qin Weibai's existence completely satisfied all the best and most exaggerated fantasies of Li Tianlan about the opposite sex. He was so deeply involved that he could not even extricate himself. The big soft bed seemed to be covered with snow. The snow melted on the sheets. Feeling a little uncomfortable, Li Tianlan pulled Qin Weibai out of bed. In the space on the top floor of the tallest building nearby, a streak of sword energy blocked all possible sights from the outside world. Qin Weibai held onto the window, her cheeks burning. Outside the window was the increasingly messy flying snow. It was pure white like the best human world. From 4 o'clock until 9 o'clock in the morning, Li Tianlan's military exploits were outstanding. When the phone rang, Li Tianlan was in the most critical state and didn't even pay attention to it. When the slightly hoarse but sexier singing stopped, the two casually took a shower and put away the bedsheets. Then the phone rang again. Li Tianlan, who had made great contributions, felt refreshed. However, he was too lazy to move at the moment. Qin Weibai was held in his arms in an extremely domineering manner, and his palm carelessly played with her hair. Qin Weibai, with her big misty eyes, gently rubbed against Li Tianlan's chest and murmured something that Li Tianlan could not understand. In the spacious bedroom, the smell of ambiguity mixed with the more intense fragrance of Qin Weibai, forming a smell that gradually made one's heart beat faster. Li Tianlan was tempted again. Qin Weibai shrank in Li Tianlan's arms, covered with the quilt, and pressed one leg on him. Li Tianlan looked down at her and chuckled. "What are you doing?" Qin Weibai looked at him with her watery and bright eyes, and then gave him a hard look. It's still early, Li Tianlan said. Gluttony. Qin Weibai said bitterly, you're so annoying. You only know how to bully me. Qin Weibai's palm slid down. Just as she was about to say something, the phone rang again. Li Tianlan felt a little helpless. He reached out and took the phone, only to find that it was a call from Dongqing Wudi. And the previous 2 calls were from Dongqing Wudi. Li Tianlan's eyes narrowed slightly and he answered the phone. Tianlan, you just got up? On the other end of the phone, Dongqing Wudi asked with a smile. His voice sounded relaxed, but in fact there was a well-hidden heaviness in it. Li Tianlan was a little embarrassed. He was too embarrassed to say that he had not slept all night, and it was even more inappropriate to brag that he had made great achievements last night. He subconsciously looked down at Qin Weibai. The goddess, whose face was still ruddy, glared at him weakly and gently bit his chest. Well, I just got up. Li Tianlan responded. His palm grabbed at random on the bed and grabbed a pair of soft and delicate silk underwear. Qin Weibai, with rosy cheeks, reached out to grab it. Li Tianlan's palm shook and moved further and further away from her. Qin Weibai gradually left the quilt, and the spring scenery bloomed again. Dongqing Wudi was silent on the phone for a while. When Li Tianlan realized something, he found that Dongqing Wudi had been silent for nearly 2 minutes. Minister. Li Tianlan called out with some confusion. The thing in his hand was snatched away. Li Tianlan didn't mind. His arm grasped a mountain and in a trance he felt like he could cover the sky with one hand. Then a bomb seemed to explode directly next to his ear. Dongqing Wudi's voice sounded. Qin Fangqing is dead. The smile on Li Tianlan's face suddenly froze. He didn't seem to hear Dongqing Wudi's words clearly. He asked again, what did you say? Qin Fangqing is dead. Dongqing Wudi repeated it again. Li Tianlan was completely silent. This news had a huge impact, drowning out all other thoughts of Li Tianlan and fiercely attacking his will. Qin Fangqing, whom he had just met last night. Qin Fangqing, whom he was bound to kill. Qin Fangqing, who seemed to have reached some consensus with the academics. Dead. Li Tianlan wanted to say that it was impossible. But he also knew that Dongqing Wudi had no need to deceive him. But how could it be? Li Tianlan was silent for a full 5 minutes. Dongqing Wudi held the phone and waited for him for a full 5 minutes. Obviously, not only Li Tianlan and Dongqing Wudi, but also everyone needed to digest the sudden news for a while. Li Tianlan frowned tightly and said in a low voice, when? About 3 hours ago. The body was found 90 minutes ago. An hour ago, all the counselors were notified. We had an emergency discussion and decided to spread the news to the counselors. I called you before but no one answered. I just finished the meeting. Dongqing Wudi's voice was low. The previous call was also about an hour ago. That was to say, the council wanted to inform him as soon as they found out that Qin Fangqing was dead, but he didn't answer at that time. Li Tianlan frowned tightly and unconsciously stroked Qin Weibai's snow-white shoulder. He said in a low voice, what's the cause of death? Cerebral hemorrhage. Dongqing Wudi said, the forensic doctor has made a simple identification. The brainstem hemorrhage was very large and the death was sudden. For the time being, we can't be sure of any external factors. According to the forensic doctor's estimation, even if he were to be resuscitated, there was basically no hope. He wanted to say something but stopped for a moment. He suddenly asked, did you and Bosch Qin go to the Hidden Dragon Sea last night? Li Tianlan reacted immediately. His face was a little gloomy, but it had nothing to do with Dongqing Wudi. He was thinking about the situation after that. Department head Ai Xiaobai and I are not stupid. Yesterday was his first day in Yuzhou, and both he and Qin Weibai had seen Qin Fangqing. Less than a few hours after they met, Qin Fangqing died mysteriously. Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai both had alibis. But for someone like Li Tianlan who stood at the peak of martial arts apart from himself, there was probably no one else in the world who could understand him in detail. He struck without batting an eyelid, causing a person to die a few hours later. Moreover, it was diagnosed as a cerebral hemorrhage. It seemed a little unbelievable. Normal martial arts couldn't do it. Even an expert at the peak of the invincible realm couldn't do it. But no one knew if Li Tianlan could do it. Wang Tianzong was missing. In the current dark world, Li Tianlan's height was almost unique and could even be said to be supreme. Moreover, Qin Weibai. Perhaps other high-level officials in Zhongzhou state didn't know. But Li Tianlan and Dongqing Wudi knew very well that in the spiritual field, Qin Weibai was the real master. There were too many mysteries and weirdness in this field. Hypnosis couldn't be explained clearly. Compared with Li Tianlan's sudden strike, Qin Weibai was more likely to give Qin Fangqing some hints without anyone noticing. Hypnosis could indeed kill a person who was not strong-willed. Qin Fangqing had been in a passive situation recently and was getting more and more desperate. His will was likely to have relaxed. It was just that most people who were killed by hypnosis committed suicide. This kind of sudden cerebral hemorrhage. How could hypnosis do it? Li Tianlan thought for a moment and said softly, "Department head, I need to think about it. I'll call you later." Dongqing Wudi replied with a and seemed to be relieved. To be honest, he really didn't worry about Qin Weibai. No one thought that the goddess, who was devastatingly beautiful, was just a vase, even if she was the most expensive and priceless vase. Her maturity and calmness in dealing with things could be described as wisdom. In the current situation, Li Tianlan was the one who made Dongqing Wudi most uneasy. Qin Fangqing's death was inevitable, but his death now was a great trouble. Qin Weibai couldn't hurt him now. But it was hard to say for Li Tianlan. He might not see those troubles, but he might not care. If it wasn't for Li Tianlan, then was Qin Fangqing's death really natural? No external factors? He silently hung up the phone. Li Tianlan thought silently for a while and lifted the quilt. Qin Weibai straightened up and still kept her kneeling position. Her moist red lips slightly pouted and she said pitifully, "My knees are uncomfortable." Li Tianlan smiled and held her in his arms. After a moment of silence, he whispered, "Qin Fangqing is dead." So fast. Qin Weibai was shocked. Her reaction also surprised Li Tianlan. The first thing Li Tianlan thought about when he got the news was how Qin Fangqing died. However, Qin Weibai's reaction was tantamount to asking why Qin Fangqing would die now. Li Tianlan frowned and asked softly, "What happened?" Qin Weibai seemed a little hesitant and confused. With some uncertainty she said, "I don't know. After seeing him yesterday, his mental state was very unstable. I gave him a hint. Under normal circumstances, it would be very effective in stabilizing his mental state. However, that hint, to a certain extent, is equivalent to a spiritual imprint. He will slowly change in Qin Fangqing's mind." Qin Weibai frowned. To put it simply, Qin Fangqing's mental state was very bad yesterday. It could even be said that he was on the verge of a breakdown. The hint I gave him was not to restore stability, but to overdraw stability. His spirit would be stabilized under the suggestion, but it would also be equivalent to overdrawing his mental strength. As time passed, when the validity of the suggestion passed, he would show different tendencies. At first, it would be self-harm and then it would develop into suicide. The deadline should be around half a year. "Did you decide on the spur of the moment?" Li Tianlan asked. Said, "I already had plans." Qin Weibai shook her head. Her somewhat misty and watery eyes became clear. "We can deal with the Qin family, but if we directly attack Qin Fangqing and kill him directly, even if he retreats, it will cause a very bad impact. My way is very covert. Even if others suspect something, they can't find full evidence. That spiritual hint is indeed to stabilize Qin Fangqing's spirit. Originally, the time of the hint would be up to a year shortly after the election, but yesterday Qin Fangqing and Li Huaqing appeared together. We can't underestimate Qin Fangqing too much. He has been the prime minister for 10 years. Even if he is at the end of his rope, he is still very powerful. If he plans something with the academics, the election is likely to be variable. So I strengthened the spiritual hint and shortened it to half a year. But why did he commit suicide in one day?" "Suicide?" Li Tianlan was stunned and then shook his head. "No, this should have nothing to do with your spiritual hint. Qin Fangqing had a cerebral hemorrhage. It was a natural death caused by massive bleeding of the brain stem." Natural death, natural death. Qin Weibai and Li Tianlan's thoughts were synchronized and they both said the word at the same time. Then they looked at each other again. Is it really a natural death? For the time being, no one could answer this question. Li Tianlan's face was a little gloomy. Qin Fangqing's death was too sudden. He already knew what he would face next. "Let's go and have a look." Qin Weibai turned over and wanted to grab the clothes that Li Tianlan had thrown under the bed last night. "No need." Li Tianlan touched her hair. "You rest, I'll go and have a look." After a pause he chuckled. "I guess you don't have much strength left, do you?" Qin Weibai's face turned red. She and Li Tianlan had a deep understanding of each other. Although they were not married, there was no difference between them and a real husband and wife. But in some aspects, Qin Weibai was still very reserved, the kind of reserve that Li Tianlan could not stop. Gluttony. Qin Weibai rolled her eyes at Li Tianlan and said with hatred. Then she put the clothes that she had grabbed on the bed. Li Tianlan got out of bed and put on his clothes. Qin Weibai had already shrunk under the quilt. Her body was curled up and only her face was exposed. The curtains were still open and the flying snow was like goose feathers. Ruthless landed lightly on Li Tianlan's body. I'm leaving. Li Tianlan bent down and kissed Qin Weibai's face, saying softly. The goddess, who had been gluttonous all night, tried to open her eyes and nodded in a daze. Li Tianlan turned and walked out. The sound of the door closing rang out. In a trance it was very close and very far. Qin Weibai closed her eyes. In a trance, her consciousness seemed to enter a garden. The bright sunshine was warm and cozy. The beautiful snowflakes were dancing in the air with a soft temperature, but they did not fall to the ground. She found herself wearing a gorgeous and complicated long dress. The color and pattern of the long dress were constantly changing in the sunshine, and it was perfectly integrated with the surrounding environment. At the edge of the garden was a twisted tree. The tree seemed to be extremely old and it was ridiculously thick. The huge canopy seemed to occupy the whole sky, leaving a large area of shade. Above the sky, the snowflakes danced with the sun with the same temperature. The snowflakes fell slowly, but they always turned into nothingness the moment they fell to the ground. However, the snowflakes that did not fall to the ground passed through the dense canopy, leaving a large area of white under the tree, which looked a little gloomy. Under the gloomy tree sat a child who was dressed in shabby clothes. He wore a small suit full of patches and looked 8 or 9 years old. He curled up in the snow on the tree trunk, and his whole body was slowly submerged by the snow. The child held his shoulders and his body trembled. But his eyes were extremely calm from beginning to end. Qin Weibai frowned and walked out of the garden. The garden disappeared. The child looked up and glanced at her. The calm eyes were replaced by amazement in an instant. He stared blankly without saying a word as if he had forgotten to speak. You are? Qin Weibai asked in a low voice. She was a master of spirit. Even if she was very tired now, her spirit was not weak, and she could even be said to be somewhat satisfied and excited. In such a state, even if she had a dream, she could also control her dream. The garden was something that should appear in her dream. But the tree in front of her, the dirty child, was a picture that should not have appeared. I'm a little cold. The child whispered. Qin Weibai looked at him seriously. His face was very clear, but the perception in the dream seemed to be blocked, making the face a little blurred in her sight. When she got closer, Qin Weibai noticed that there was a wooden sword that was almost completely buried in the snow beside the child. He leaned against the thick trunk behind him, and his small body blocked the sword marks on the trunk. If she looked closely, she would find that the trunk, which was at least 500 or 600 years old, was densely covered with cracks. It seemed that there were countless sword qi, which was not strong but always repeated, piercing into the trunk so that the trunk was always in a situation where it could collapse at any time. Qin Weibai's heart moved slightly. She seemed to understand something at this moment, but she could not believe it. Looking at the increasingly blurred face of the child, Qin Weibai breathed softly and said softly, "What's your name?" The child looked at her quietly and pursed his lips. His voice was clear and light, but the content was in line with Qin Weibai's guess. My name is Li Tianlan. The wind and snow were dancing wildly. Above the tree. Outside the hotel. On the big bed in the hotel, Qin Weibai suddenly opened her eyes. Chapter 1080. When he walked out of the hotel room, Li Tianlan had an idea and pressed the doorbell of the opposite suite. It was Shenyuan Wushang's room. To be honest, Li Tianlan didn't know what Shenyuan Wushang could do in Yuzhou, but Li Tianlan instinctively took this mysterious but intimate person with him. Chen Fangqing's death made Li Tianlan instinctively feel that Shenyuan Wushang would be useful. After all, he claimed to be an excellent doctor and Li Tianlan had seen his means. Although his means of treatment were incredible, it could be regarded as a medical category that was temporarily incomprehensible. Chen Fangqing's death was sudden and strange. If Shenyuan Wushang could get some information from his body, it might be of great use. Shenyuan Wushang quickly opened the door. He was dressed neatly and had a kind and harmless smile. Good morning, big brother. Li Tianlan nodded and asked, Have you had breakfast? Shenyuan Wushang shook his head and said with a smile, I went online last night and looked up information all night. It was very interesting. Let's go together. Li Tianlan turned to the elevator. Come with me to a place later. Okay. Xinyuan Wushang took the room card and closed the door without asking any questions. What information? I can ask someone to find it for you. Li Tianlan asked casually as he entered the elevator. Xinyuan Wushang laughed and said, I need to know more about this world in many aspects. There are all kinds of information, including history, writing, international society, and even language. I can slowly look it up on the internet. Anyway, I have nothing to do. Li Tianlan took a deep look at him. For a moment he couldn't understand the meaning of this sentence. Xinyuan Wushang spoke as if it was the first time he came into contact with this society. He hesitated and still didn't ask anything. If it was something that could be said, there was no need for him to deliberately not say it. The elevator went all the way down. When it was about to reach the restaurant, Li Tianlan suddenly said, Qin Fangqing is dead. Xinyuan Wushang nodded casually. This news, which was enough to shock the whole Zhongzhou state and even cause a lot of repercussions around the world, was not as important to him as breakfast. How did he die? He asked casually. Sudden death due to cerebral hemorrhage. Li Tianlan said. The news began to spin in his mind the moment Dongqing Wudi told him, which made him a little upset. TSK, he's really unlucky. If he had met me earlier, Xinyuan Wushang sighed and shook his head. On the surface, it is indeed a cerebral hemorrhage. In a while you will come with me to the Qin family. I need you to help me take a look and see if there is any other reason. Even if there is a trace of possibility, I want to know. Li Tianlan said slowly. Qin Fangqing's death indeed had a great influence on the new group. It seemed to be a coincidence that Qin Fangqing died less than 12 hours after Zhang Tai arrived at Yuzhou province. But things that were too coincidental always carried the color of a conspiracy. Li Tianlan didn't have to think about it to know that he was now the most suspicious target. To be honest, Li Tianlan didn't want to kill Qin Fangqing now. Although he wished Qin Fangqing could die right away, the more sensitive a matter was, the more it needed to be accepted by people. Li Tianlan's plan was to suppress Qin Fangqing's influence little by little, which would take a few months. A few months later, when everything was ready, he would force Qin Fangqing to retire due to illness and handle this matter in a high-profile manner to plant a cause. When everyone knew that he was ill, he would kill Qin Fangqing in a few months, so that he would be unable to influence the election at the most critical time and eliminate the last variable. At that time, the Prince Group would have been impatient because of the pressure from the major groups and had enough psychological preparation for Qin Fangqing's death. His death would not cause too much reaction. But now Qin Fangqing suddenly died. Li Tianlan was very clear that he had never been a calm person who was good at forbearance in the impression of the high-level officials of Zhongzhou state. They would even think that he was a lunatic in some aspects. Zhongzhou state had seen his madness more than 2 years ago. Under such a preconceived impression, Qin Fangqing's sudden death, under everyone's instinct, the first suspect must be himself. Regardless of the fact, once such a suspicion appeared, it would first arouse the disgust of all the groups. The disgust of Emperor Dong's palace. Yes, all the groups. Including the academics that were cooperating, the North group that the two sides were trying to integrate, the Giant group that could be said to be one of their own, the Prince group that had become an enemy, the Southeast group whose relationship was still unclear for the time being, and the Special Warfare group that was struggling to protect itself. The reason? Was very simple. Because Qin Fangqing was the Prime Minister. This was a completely different concept from 2 years ago when Li Tianlan slaughtered Qi Mulin's family. Qi Mulin was at the level of deputy governor, and he was not the head of a department. The shock caused by the destruction of his family made Li Tianlan stay in the desert prison for 2 years even with the support of the Giant group and the Southeast group. What about Qin Fangqing? He was the prime minister of a country, the real spokesperson of Zhongzhou state, and the number 2 figure. His end might be miserable or he might not be worthy of sympathy. Maybe, there were many maybe yes. But anyway, Qin Fangqing was the legitimate prime minister of Zhongzhou state now. If the murderer didn't pay any price when such a person was killed, then what was the meaning of the existence of Zhongzhou state? What was the meaning of the stability of Zhongzhou state? What was the meaning of the existence of high-level officials? If Qin Fangqing's death had something to do with Li Tianlan, then on the surface, no one in the whole Zhongzhou state would say a word for Li Tianlan. Even Dongqing Wudi couldn't say anything in public. This was a challenge to the cornerstone of a country and a complete subversion of all the orders. Li Tianlan ate breakfast slowly, but his eyes became more and more gloomy. There were a lot of thoughts in his mind. Qin Weibai imprinted the spiritual imprint on Qin Fangqing and stabilized his spirit. This should have nothing to do with Qin Fangqing's death, but from the perspective of the spiritual imprint, it was a coincidence. Li Tianlan didn't know much about some of the cutting-edge technologies of Zhongzhou state today. Although he knew it was impossible to tell whether a person had been hypnotized from a dead person, he couldn't be completely at ease, so he chose to take Xianyuan Wuxiang with him. If Xianyuan Wuxiang could find the traces of Chen Fangqing being hypnotized, it might mean that Zhongzhou state might also know. This matter must be eliminated quickly so as not to arouse any unnecessary suspicion. After clearing the suspicion on Qin Weibai, it was Li Tianlan's turn. He always knew his own affairs best. Li Tianlan's breakthrough this time left a lot of doubts in martial arts, which he couldn't figure out for a while, but he roughly knew what he could do. His sword energy could make Chen Fangqing's death look like a normal cerebral hemorrhage. But it was impossible to control the time for so long and so perfect. He couldn't do it, but the key was how to explain it and whether others would believe it or not. Seriously speaking, the possibility that others would believe it was really not very big. If they didn't believe it, it meant that the prince group, which was caught off guard and faced with Chen Fangqing's death, would quickly react after a short period of panic and bewilderment. They should have been panicky and wavering, but they would break out a great unity because of Li Tianlan's violence and gloominess. They might even stabilize the prince group again with the full support of Guo Wentian. This meant that in the process of the rise of the new group, the benefits from the prince group would be greatly reduced. The same problem applied to the major groups. When all the suspicions pointed to Li Tianlan, the giant group, which had originally planned to join the new group to wave the flag for Emperor Dong's palace under the persuasion of Dongqing Wudi and Bai Zhanfeng, was likely to hesitate. The North group, which was merging with the new group, would have even more scruples about Li Tianlan's cruelty. Military Counselor did have great influence in the North group, but such influence didn't mean that Military Counselor had any chips in his hands that could threaten the whole North group. Such influence was slowly accumulated in the long-term secret cooperation between the two sides. It was tacit understanding, sincerity, and both sides were very satisfied with the future prospects. And such a prospect would also be cast over with Chen Fangqing's death. The academics would also terminate cooperation with the new group to some extent. As for the Special Warfare Group, it was originally Li Tianlan's personal main area of influence in the future. He originally wanted to completely break up the Special Warfare Group after killing Chen Fangqing. But with Chen Fangqing's death, Li Tianlan's existence would only make them more frightened. Even if the Special Warfare Group completely fell apart and the people in the Special Warfare Group changed their allegiance, there would not be too many people who would choose Emperor Dong's palace. Li Tianlan ate breakfast and sorted out his thoughts. Then he was shocked to find that with Chen Fangqing's death, the future of the new group and Emperor Dong's palace were cast over a very heavy shadow. People in other groups would be afraid of him. However, this fear was not pure. Instead, it was mixed with disgust and rejection. Even if a new corporation were to appear under such emotions, its scale would probably be greatly limited. At most, it would only be 2/3 of the expected size, and this was under the premise that they were lucky enough. Chen Fangqing's death is very troublesome, Li Tianlan said all of a sudden. Xianyuan Wuxiang nodded. As a prince, he usually studied more than medicine. It was hard to say how old he was, but objectively speaking, it was almost an eternity. He had played many roles and studied many different things. Although he did not know whether it was him or not, his consciousness had never deviated too much. Based on his experience, unless there was a new variable, Li Tianlan would face more than just trouble. Let's wait and see, Xianyuan Wuxiang said softly. He thought for a moment and continued, Big brother, in your current situation, the only choice is to compromise. Even if it's a temporary compromise, after all, there is still nearly a year to operate. It's not a big deal to compromise temporarily. Li Tianlan did not say anything. After a long while, he suddenly asked, What can you see? I don't know. Xianyuan Wuxiang smiled and said, I have to see it first. Hopefully I can find something interesting. Li Tianlan took a deep look at him and said slowly, Your abilities are very strange. You don't seem to be very old, so I don't know what kind of group you are. I think you can't tell me about this. However, it is obvious that you are not the strongest, and the Lin Shi you mentioned is also not the strongest. You can even be regarded as the younger generation, which means that in your group, there are people who are stronger and more comprehensive than you. So, do you have the ability to see clearly what Chen Fangqing experienced before he died? Xianyuan Wuxiang was silent for a moment. Comprehensive? He muttered to himself and shook his head slightly. No one is comprehensive. Different people are involved in different fields. Big brother, your request involves time, which is the most basic. The requirement is very high, but it's not impossible. But from another point of view, it's also impossible. Li Tianlan felt a pain in the ass. The most critical words became a bunch of messy notes in his ears again. What do you mean? He asked patiently. My father can do it. Xinyuan Wushang said slowly, that's one of our most powerful abilities. In theory, it's equivalent to imprinting Chen Fangqing into a painting. Through it, we can see everything that happened before he died. This so-called everything was not only what he had experienced, but also what he had thought, and even what he had imagined in his consciousness. This ability will only fail for a few people, but Chen Fangqing is not one of them. My father has this ability, but the place is not right. He can't do it here. Li Tianlan was shocked. He didn't understand many things Xinyuan Wushang said, but he understood the most important sentence very clearly. Xinyuan Wushang said that his request involved time, and his father could do it. Could it be understood that Xinyuan Wushang's father could control time? Supernatural ability? The term flashed through Li Tianlan's mind, and then he asked directly. Xinyuan Wushang shook his head. It's not supernatural ability, it's just... He scratched his head and looked a little cautious. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that he can't do it here. Then where can he do it? Li Tianlan asked immediately. If there really was such an ability, even if there were great restrictions, it would be almost heaven-defying. Li Tianlan couldn't believe it. I can't tell. Xinyuan Wushang was silent for a moment and said softly. If Li Tianlan had felt that Xinyuan Wushang's origin was mysterious before, then this time as Xinyuan Wushang mentioned his father, Li Tianlan began to be really curious about this group of people. That is to say, your father's generation is much stronger than yours. Maybe not only you, but also Lin Shi's father's generation. How strong is the strongest person in your group? Xinyuan Wushang gave Li Tianlan a strange look. He saw strong interest in Li Tianlan's eyes as well as strong suspicion. At the same time he also saw a very obvious fear. Xinyuan Wushang smiled bitterly and shook his head slightly. Big brother, you think too highly of us. In fact, as far as I know, including Lin Shi's father, even Lin Shi's grandfather, among all the people I've seen and heard of, my father is the strongest one. I don't know, but now I'm basically sure that it's the end, so my understanding should be correct. My father is a martial artist as well as a calligrapher. He's really strong, but when facing you here, even if he's at his peak, he won't be much stronger than you. I paid attention to the state you used to be ruthless on Mount Dibbing. That state in our place is called the law of swordsmanship. To be exact, it's the state when you made another breakthrough in the invincible realm and reached the peak of the so-called supreme realm, big brother. That's also the limit of my father's combat strength. From this point of view, if the current ruthless energy returns to its peak, your strength with ruthless is basically my father's combat strength at his peak. As for Lin Shi's father, he's also a very great figure, but the combat strength he can exert is not as good as my father's. At most, he's a little stronger than Wang Tianzong a few years ago. So specifically in this era, big brother, you're invincible. When you break through again and reach the threshold of sword law, I can tell you a lot of things. I can't believe there's such a person in the world. Li Tianlan was lost in thought. Is there? Xinyuan Wushang smiled bitterly. Some people exist, but do they really exist? The Sword Dao's law that you speak of is the limit of combat power that you know. Li Tianlan suddenly asked. Yes. Xinyuan Wushang hesitated and slowly said, not really. It depends on where it is. After a moment of silence, Li Tianlan lowered his head and drank the last spoonful of soup in front of him. He stood up and said, let's go. Xinyuan Wushang followed him, following his every step. Have you ever thought about what position in Emperor Dong's palace? Li Tianlan suddenly asked. Xinyuan Wushang obviously didn't know much about the outside world. He could already understand the special nature of Chen Fangqing's case after just one night of searching. He could even infer the plan of Emperor Dong's palace from some aspects and then tell himself that the best way now was to compromise. This kind of keenness was enough to prove his ability in some aspects. After all, the existence of new groups and the Six was always very hidden, which was not something that could be found by searching on the internet. Military counselor had been talking to him about retirement. Li Tianlan thought that he could put Xinyuan Wushang with military counselor. Maybe after a few years of training, Xinyuan Wushang would become the second CEO of Emperor Dong's palace. I'll open a small clinic in Xinyuan City and be a doctor. It's good. Xinyuan Wushang smiled and said, I've already found a security guard. Xing Tian will do. Li Tianlan looked at Xinyuan Wushang and didn't speak for a while. Xing Tian was equivalent to an expert of the invincible realm, and he was an expert who was close to the peak of the invincible realm. Security guard? Who could be so extravagant? We're all a little tired and really don't want to get involved in the specific affairs of Emperor Dong's palace. If our speculation is right, I won't stay in Emperor Dong's palace for long, and this precious time may be our last time to rest. He looked at Li Tianlan and said seriously, "Big brother, I really want to be free." Got it? Li Tianlan was silent for a while and nodded. Chapter 1081. The car slowly entered the manor of the Bai family. When it approached the luxurious villa in the center, Li Tianlan saw Bai Qingzhao standing at the door with a frown. He was dressed in a neat military uniform and his posture was tall and straight. The general star on his shoulder shone with golden light. He looked a little anxious as he paced back and forth, but there was an unconcealable coldness and murderous intent on his solemn expression as he was wrapped in silver and white clothing. Xinyuan Wushang, who acted as the driver, sped up a little at Li Tianlan's order. Before the car came to a complete stop, Li Tianlan had opened the door and got out. He took a few quick steps to shake hands with Bai Qingzhao and said softly, "Secretary General." He called Bai Qingzhao by his title, even in private. Li Tianlan always called Bai Qingzhao by his title. But in terms of blood relationship, Li Tianlan knew very well that this was his uncle. Li Tianlan didn't want to change the way he called him, but he didn't want to hide his respect. From the bottom of his heart, Li Tianlan really had no hatred or obstacles for his biological parents and their families. He did suffer a lot when he was a child, but today he had received enough returns. He left the Li family for Huading at the age of 19. It had been nearly 6 years since then. He had seen the attitudes of the Dongqing clan and the Bai family. He had also seen what Dongqing Wudi and Bai Qingqian had done. Hatred? Resentment? Li Tianlan really didn't care about it. What was a family? It was a proposition so huge that it was difficult for anyone to explain it in detail. Different times, different situations, and different decisions would have different interpretations. Li Tianlan hadn't been in the Dongqing clan for more than 20 years. In the eyes of Dongqing Wudi, this was the family's debt to Li Tianlan. They were trying their best to make up for it. Li Tianlan often wanted to tell them that it was enough, that it was really enough, but they obviously didn't have the concept of enough or not enough. Li Tianlan could be made up for, but how could Bai Qingqian and Dongqing Wudi, who had been respectful to each other for 20 years, almost become enemies? Born in a wealthy family from the beginning of their birth, they were born with not only glory but also the responsibility to maintain this glory. Li Tianlan might have had too many things, even many of which the Dongqing clan didn't have. He stood high enough and was calm enough so he could look at these problems more rationally. He always didn't want to call them parents just because he was unfamiliar with this title after so many years, and it had nothing to do with anything else. He's here. Bai Qingzhao tried his best to show a gentle smile. Go in, everyone is waiting for you. Li Tianlan knew very well who they were. Chen Fangqing's death was so sudden that it caused the tense atmosphere before the election to completely explode. At this time, inside the manor of the Bai family, 2 directors and 2 parliamentarians of Zhongzhou state, whom Li Tianlan was most familiar with, were gathered. Later, when those key members of the giant group who did not work in Yuzhou got the news, this place would become more lively. This was the moment when a slight change in one hair could affect the whole body. What kind of attitude should they use to face the sensation caused by Chen Fangqing's death? This was something that every group was currently studying. Li Tianlan nodded and entered the villa under the guidance of Bai Qingzhao. Xinyuan Wushang, who didn't treat himself as an outsider, also followed them. Bai Qingzhao, who thought he was a driver, looked at him in surprise, but he didn't say anything. The 3 of them entered the study. The spacious and comfortable study was almost covered with clouds and mist. When Li Tianlan walked in, the 2 directors, Dongqing Wudi and Zhou Mulin, and the 2 parliamentarians, Bai Zhanfeng and Wu Jingmin, were sitting on the sofa with a cigarette in their hands. The smoke was lingering, mixed with the incense that Bai Zhanfeng had lit. The smell in the study was pungent, but there was a touch of the comfort of incense. Bai Zhanfeng directly lit a cigarette and joined the ranks of smokers. He also handed one to Li Tianlan and Xinyuan Wushang. Li Tianlan took it and lit it. Xinyuan Wushang seemed to be a little curious about the smell of the cigarette. After thinking about it, he also lit it and took a puff. It's going to catch fire. Li Tianlan said jokingly, turned on the ventilation system, and casually greeted several leaders. Zhou Mulin first, then Bai Zhanfeng, then Wu Jingmin, and finally Dongqing Wudi. He didn't know what the order of greeting was, but Dongqing Wudi's originally gloomy face obviously became a little cheerful. Li Tianlan casually found a seat and sat down. Xinyuan Wushang, who had been silent, nodded to everyone present and sat next to Li Tianlan. In the study, several big shots who could be regarded as the leaders of Zhongzhou state, looked at each other and subconsciously at Bai Qingzhao, who had just sat down. Bai Qingzhao was also a little confused. He had never seen Xinyuan Wushang. Li Tianlan brought him into the study, which meant that Li Tianlan thought Xinyuan Wushang was qualified to come in. It was not that the leaders of the new group and the giant group talked about some stupid rules. It was just that not everyone could hear this conversation. After Qin Fangqing's death, all the spearheads were aimed at the new group. The storm was coming. This conversation might mean the strategic direction of the new group in the next 5 to 10 years. Li Tianlan brought this little fatty in, which showed his trust in him. But the other party sat down naturally without nervousness or uneasiness. He was peaceful and calm. It seemed that he was going to discuss with them how to deal with this crisis. Tianlan, who is this? Dongqing Wudi asked blankly. He looked at Xinyuan Wushang with some doubts. Well? Li Tianlan also glanced at Xinyuan Wushang. Xinyuan Wushang had been calling him Big Brother, which was natural. But Li Tianlan felt that Xinyuan Wushang was definitely older than him, even in terms of appearance. Li Tianlan shook his head slightly and introduced, "This is my younger brother." Dongqing Wudi looked confused and thought, "Where did you get your younger brother?" Li Tianlan's voice continued, "Xinyuan Wushang is a doctor." After a pause, Li Tianlan continued, "We can completely trust him. He is different from other doctors. In fact, he saved my life a day ago and my breakthrough also has a lot to do with him. So I plan to take him to see Qin Fangqing's body. Maybe he will find some clues." Life-saving grace? They were all stunned at the same time. Dongqing Wudi fixed his eyes on Li Tianlan and said slowly, "What do you mean by saving your life? What happened in the final battle in Beihai?" It had been a day since the final battle in Beihai. From the beginning to the end, all of Li Tianlan's performance, Wang Xiaoyao, Li Guangtu, Jiang Shangyu, and even Wang Tianzong's sword energy had been sorted out and sent to all over the world. The high-level officials of Zhongzhou state had also received detailed reports. Li Tianlan was indeed threatened, but no one saw that Li Tianlan had experienced any crisis of death. Was it Wang Tianzong? Bai Zhanfang suddenly asked. No. Li Tianlan shook his head. It was Jiang Shangyu and Li Guangtu. They launched a sneak attack after I left Mount Dibing. The situation was very dangerous at that time. If it weren't for Wushang, I would probably have died on the spot and couldn't even go back to Tianan. It was really dangerous, but this injury also helped me go further in martial arts and smoothly broke through. It was a blessing in disguise. Everyone came to their senses. Breakthrough. Li Tianlan broke through. This was a situation that all the forces in the world had not mastered in detail. Maybe some people would know that Li Tianlan had defeated Wang Xingxiao in Emperor Dong's palace, but no one could be sure that Li Tianlan had broken through. Such a breakthrough also meant invincible realm? Dongqing Wudi looked excited and expectant. The whole dark world knew that Li Tianlan's invincible realm was completely different from the regular invincible realm. Li Tianlan, who had not yet entered the invincible realm, could already fight against Jiang Shangyu and Li Guangtu together. How strong would Li Tianlan be after successfully entering the invincible realm? A 24-year-old invincible realm expert, which even meant that the next few decades would belong to Li Tianlan. Such a long peak period was enough to make any enemy completely desperate. Li Tianlan nodded and smiled. His breakthrough this time was far more than just the invincible realm. Although the increase in combat capability did not meet expectations, it was only because he still had a lot of doubts in his heart. Apart from other things, if the second heart was exposed, it was almost enough to subvert some fields of biology. The interval between his second heartbeats was extremely long, but every beat was strengthening his body. The excessive vitality showed that the second heart beat twice in a day. Li Tianlan had a total of 2 nosebleeds, and the first time he even bled from the 7 orifices. This was still his regular state. In the state of combat, every beat of the second heart would instantly restore his physical strength to the peak state. It was no exaggeration to say that with the second heart, Li Tianlan's physical strength was almost endless. Even Wang Tianzong did not have this kind of breakthrough when he reached that supreme level. In some ways, it was not so much a breakthrough as an evolution. The evolution of life level. However, Li Tianlan himself did not know these things very well at present. Xinyuan Wushang knew something, but he could not say many things, so Li Tianlan could only use the word breakthrough to describe his current state. This is really good news. Zhou Mulin, who had the least contact with Li Tianlan, smiled. He looked at Li Tianlan with very soft eyes. Seeing you, I realize that I am really old and I have to admit that I am old. Bai Zhanfang smiled. Wu Jingmin also smiled and there was some meaning in his eyes. Chen Fangqing's death is not necessarily bad news. Xianyuan Wushang suddenly said. Several people turned their eyes to Xianyuan Wushang at the same time. Xianyuan Wushang smiled very kindly. He looked at Li Tianlan and said slowly, "Big brother, do you have any doubts in your heart?" "I'm not sure." Li Tianlan shook his head. When others were doubting him, he also had a highly suspicious target in his heart, but he was not sure who the target was. The academics, the special warfare group, the prince group, or even Chen Fangqing himself set him up at the cost of his life. All these were possible. "Are you suspecting that someone set you up for this?" Bai Qingzhao suddenly asked. As the eldest son of the Bai family and the backbone of the giant group, Bai Zhanfang would step down after this election and give up the position of Speaker of Yuzhou. This position was also the focus of all parties at present. When Bai Zhanfang stepped down and Bai Qingqian went to the new group, Bai Qingzhao would inevitably take over. His position was not completely determined at present, but it could basically be defined. Bai Qingzhao and Dongqing Wudi had a tacit understanding, so after the election he would still stay in the army headquarters. It was necessary for him to enter the parliament. Obviously, it was not certain whether Bai Qingzhao would be the deputy minister of the army headquarters or the secretary general. This undoubtedly depended on the result of the game between all parties. But specifically within the group, Bai Qingzhao was already a member of parliament in the eyes of many people. If not, Bai Qingzhao would not participate in this kind of discussion. "It's really possible, isn't it?" Li Tianlan said slowly. "I always feel that Chen Fangqing's death is too coincidental. Well, I'm here so we can first rule out ourselves and then rule out the real coincidence. Then, someone must have done it secretly, not me. Who else could it be?" If that's the case, Dongqing Wudi's eyes were a little cold. The other party is really ruthless. His plot must be big. Is the position of the head of the cabinet enough? Wu Jingmin suddenly asked with a smile. This sentence was tantamount to saying that it was the academics who played tricks in the dark. Killing Chen Fangqing and framing the new group made the new group suffer a major setback. It had to compromise on some key issues and support Hua Xingyang to take over. At present, this was undoubtedly the most critical issue. "President?" Zhou Mulin recalled Li Huaqing and finally shook his head slightly. "He doesn't look like a person who can do this kind of thing. Neither does Hua Xingyang." Zhou Mulin could be said to be the most low-key of the directors in Zhongzhou state. Even Zhou Yunhai, who had the weakest sense of existence, was more high-profile than him. Since Dongqing Wudi became a director 5 years ago, Zhou Mulin basically lived an early retirement life except for speaking out on some major issues. Although the old man kept a low profile, he was very accurate in judging people all his life and almost never made a mistake. His words at this time obviously did not agree with Wu Jingmin's inference. "Guo Wentian?" Bai Zhanfang suddenly asked. "He has the motive to do it, but he may not have the strength." Dongqing Wudi shook his head. "I heard that Guo Wentian spent some time alone with Chen Fangqing yesterday. The prince group is in a bad situation now. Chen Fangqing's death is easier to unite them against the common enemy." Bai Qingzhao said thoughtfully. "What about Chen Fangqing himself?" Li Tianlan suddenly said. Dongqing Wudi was stunned. Everyone was stunned. "You mean? Suicide?" Dongqing Wudi asked in a low voice. The study fell into silence. Everyone was thinking about this possibility. Chen Fangqing is not a good person. Li Tianlan said blandly, "But if he is a responsible prime minister, no one can refute it. I will kill him, but it doesn't mean that I don't approve of some of his characters. He has indeed devoted his life to Zhongzhou state." "Ha!" Li Tianlan suddenly sneered. "He always called me a national thief." When he was at the end of his rope and in a desperate situation, he used his own life as the last bargaining chip to curb the development of the new group when he was unable to struggle. Isn't that his character? There was silence. After a long time, Bai Zhanfang sighed softly. "That guy, no." Wu Jingmin said with certainty. He looked at Li Tianlan with a complicated look in his eyes. Finally he smiled softly. "What you said makes sense. He is indeed devoted to Zhongzhou state, but it is also because of this that Chen Fangqing is the least likely to commit suicide. His death can indeed curb the development of the new group to some extent, but it is more likely to cause the greatest chaos. Tianlan, you can't expect Chen Fangqing to know nothing about your character. If he really committed suicide, then he must know that you will not be reconciled. He knows how much power you have now. Your unwillingness will plunge Zhongzhou state into great chaos, which is definitely not what Qin Fangqing wants to see. He looked into Li Tianlan's eyes and said softly, he admitted his failure, so he will wait for you to kill him. After everything is settled, he will choose to let himself die in your hands to keep Zhongzhou state stable. In his view, this is the last thing he will do for Zhongzhou state. Li Tianlan sat there and was silent for a long time. Where is Qin Fangqing's body? Xianyuan Wushang suddenly asked. In the Qin family. It was sent from the hidden Dragon Sea to the Qin family an hour ago. Zhongzhou state will release the official news in the evening at the latest. Let's go and have a look first. Xianyuan Wushang thought for a while and said slowly. When he spoke, his tone was very confident. Perhaps apart from him, only Li Tianlan knew how difficult it was to kill Qin Fangqing. Excluding the possibility of coincidence, there were not many people who could do this. As far as Xianyuan Wushang knew, only Li Tianlan and Xing Tian who were in the neutral camp could do this. But they could not do it. If it was not them, then there were only two directions. Either it was the order, or the shadow. Jiang Shangyu. Lin Shi. There were only two possibilities. And with their strength, if they did something, Xianyuan Wushang could not have missed it. Lin Shi must have known this. Therefore, Xianyuan Wushang had locked his suspicion on Jiang Shangyu. Because only Jiang Shangyu did not know the existence of him and Lin Shi. Only under such circumstances could Jiang Shangyu think that his move was flawless. As long as we really confirm the cause of Qin Fangqing's death and find out the inside story, then we can find out the person behind the scenes. For the new group, this is not a bad thing. Xianyuan Wushang smiled and his voice became calmer. Li Tianlan suddenly glanced at him and said thoughtfully, do you already have a suspect? Yes, but I'm not sure. Xianyuan Wushang said, I can tell you a piece of news. Before the decisive battle in Beihai, Jiang Shangyu and President Li Huaqing had a very secret communication. The specific content is unknown. Chapter 1082. Li Huaqing. Jiang Shangyu. Either of these two people was enough to attract the absolute attention of everyone present. When the two names were combined, the deterrence produced was definitely not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. If the academics cooperated with Jiang Shangyu, the chemical reaction would be extremely amazing. Similarly, Li Tianlan was also very clear that such a possibility existed, and the probability was not low. At this moment, he suddenly remembered the conversation he had with Zhuang Huayang, the headmaster when he first entered the Sky Academy. A 10-year plan. At that time, Li Tianlan, who was far from amazing, was solemnly invited by Zhuang Huayang to join the academics in order to use 10 years to let Li Tianlan grow up and make up for some structural defects of the academics. The academics' shortcomings were not only that it had a short time to rise and did not establish close ties with some retired but influential old people. They also had a huge lack of voice in the dark world and the special warfare system. In this respect, it was indispensable within any group. What did the special warfare system in the dark world mean? To be precise, it meant a special power outside the rules. A high degree of freedom, even the power to act first and report later, and the characteristic of not being bound by ordinary laws. In any group, such a power could play a role that could not be ignored. The foundation of the academics in this respect was almost zero. Therefore, they always seemed to be very passive when playing with other groups. That was because they abided by the rules, and even if they wanted to break the rules, they had no bargaining chips to do so. The special warfare system was the order in the shadow of Zhongzhou state. From the perspective of Zhongzhou state, the darkness itself was a kind of order. Nearly 6 years ago, Li Tianlan, who was only the heir of the Li family at that time, attracted the personal attention of Li Huaqing. Li Huaqing instructed Zhuang Huayang to invite Li Tianlan to join the academics, and then facilitated the short-term cooperation between the giant group, the academy, the Samsara Palace, and the Li family. From this point alone, it could be seen how strong the academics' voice in the special warfare system and their desire for masters were. Li Tianlan's growth might have twists and turns, but on the whole it was smooth. However, in a few years the general trend changed and Li Tianlan gradually drifted away from the academics. At this time, especially when the special warfare group was in turmoil, Jiang Shangyu and Li Huaqing secretly contacted each other. Did Li Huaqing intend to make Jiang Shangyu the core figure of the academics in the special warfare system? In contemplation, Bai Qingzhao was the first to speak. His tone was a little doubtful, but it was relatively soft. Mr. Xianyuan, You also said that this is a secret contact between the president and Jiang Shanyu. May I ask how you know about this? Xinyuan Wushang looked at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan nodded slightly, indicating that everyone present could be absolutely trusted. Xinyuan Wushang smiled and said softly, I can hack into the entire network of East Island, control their weapon systems and enter their core database. Naturally, I can also enter the core database of Zhongzhou State to see something. In fact, although the network protection of Zhongzhou State is much more advanced than that of East Island, there is no qualitative change. I checked Li Huaqing's communication record and saw the conversation between him and Jiang Shanyu. The time was 26 minutes. Starting from this point, it's easy for me to investigate something. The only pity is that I don't know what exactly they talked about. There was dead silence in the study. 2 seconds later, Dongqing Wudi suddenly stood up and stared at Xinyuan Wushang with burning eyes. Everyone looked at his seemingly harmless smiling face. A dog that bites doesn't bark. Although there was something wrong with this description, they all had the same thought in their minds. Dongqing Wudi looked at the fat man in front of him seriously, as if he wanted to record his appearance in his mind. The way he looked at Xinyuan Wushang was strange and complicated. It was as if he was looking at a devil, an angel, or a nuclear bomb that could destroy the entire world or something else. He could freely hack into the core database of Zhongzhou State and East Island, freely tamper with all the communications of a country, and freely control all the weapon systems. What did this mean? It was clear just by looking at East Island the night before. If what Xinyuan Wushang said was true. No, what he said was true. The 3 fleets of Murderous Bird, Giant Whale and Black Dragon had now been incorporated by the Zhongzhou State Navy. For this matter, Dongqing Wudi talked with Li Huaqing for a long time. Although this matter hadn't been discussed in a parliamentary meeting, the general direction had been confirmed. These 3 fleets would be incorporated into the South Sea Fleet and become the strength of the new group in the Navy. The 3 fleets would be merged into an aircraft carrier fleet, and Li Tianlan would personally appoint the commander and be awarded the rank of lieutenant general. The 3 fleets and the slow response of East Island for a whole night were the embodiment of Xinyuan Wushang's real strength. Except for the fat man in front of him, no one knew what happened in East Island that night. In that state, East Island was in a state of war. All the communications were interacting with each other at a high frequency. The imperial family, the cabinet, the army ministry, all the major martial arts schools, the rear of East Island, the front of Beihai, the special warfare system, countless departments, and countless people were exchanging information at any time. In such a highly vigilant situation, Xinyuan Wushang easily got the control of all the weapon systems in East Island and controlled all the communication networks. In that state, there were countless phone calls communicating with each other every minute and every second. If one of the phone calls made people feel that something was wrong, the delicate but extremely fragile network that Xinyuan Wushang weaved would be completely broken. But under such circumstances, Xinyuan Wushang didn't have any accident, and everyone was completely fooled by the false communication. For East Island this was a dream. In the dream Xinyuan Wushang was an angel. When he woke up from the dream Xinyuan Wushang directly turned into a devil. This kind of person, this kind of ability should be respected and valued at the highest level in any country. When everyone was confused about East Island's behavior last night, the culprit showed up right beside them. It was him. He actually did it. If Zhongzhou State had such a person, Dongqing Wudi was a very arrogant person, but at the same time he was also a person with extreme self-restraint. But when he saw Xinyuan Wushang and thought of East Island last night, even with his self-restraint, a logical idea directly popped up in his mind. With Xinyuan Wushang, Zhongzhou State could completely unify the whole world. What a ridiculous statement. What a crazy ambition. Unifying the whole world became the supreme will of hundreds of countries. This sounded inconceivable, but at this moment, it seemed so logical. Xinyuan Wushang could play East Island in the palm of his hand, which meant that the so-called top-secret and perfect firewalls of any country in Zhongzhou State, Star State, Snow Country, European land, or any other country in the world were useless in front of him. Hypothetically, under such circumstances, Zhongzhou State could completely invade without any scruples. Counterattack? There would be no such thing. When Xinyuan Wushang controlled the enemy's weapon system, the only counterattack the enemy could do was to use manpower and some guns. This level of control could even make all the high-tech weapons of the enemy turn around to attack their own country. To unify the whole world, Zhongzhou State would not even sacrifice the life of a soldier. It was so crazy, so absurd. Whether Zhongzhou State had such an idea or not, Dongqing Wudi was a soldier. A soldier's duty was not only to protect the country, but also to expand the territory. At this moment, Xianyuan Wushang in front of him was undoubtedly a treasure, which made him extremely surprised and terrified. Such an ability could indeed unify the whole world. But if there was really such a so-called unification, then did all this have anything to do with Zhongzhou State? Rather than saying that Zhongzhou State unified the world, it was better to say that Xianyuan Wushang unified the world alone. Such an ability was so obvious that it had nothing to do with Emperor Dong's palace. That kind of unscrupulous invasion was almost everywhere and impossible to guard against. In everyone's eyes, such a Xianyuan Wushang was both a devil and a god. Dongqing Wudi just looked at Xianyuan Wushang. There was a strong surprise in his eyes, and there was also undisguised cold-killing intent. No matter how strong Li Tianlan was, he was only one person after all. He might be able to fight against the whole world and hundreds of thousands of troops, but he was still one person. What he could guarantee was absolute domination in the dark world. Even if Li Tianlan was 100 times stronger, he could not destroy the whole world in an instant. Everyone would be afraid of him and would be afraid of him. The world could accommodate Li Tianlan. Xianyuan Wushang was different. Completely different. He had the ability to rule the world at will and destroy the world at will. Li Tianlan at least needed to draw his sword to kill. And he was just a simple invasion. He invaded Zhongzhou State, Snow Country, Star State, and any other country. With a bang, the world would be destroyed. What was this? What the hell was this? Such a person should not exist. His existence would be absolutely hostile and feared by everyone. If such a person's ability was exposed, the whole world would kill him at all costs, including Zhongzhou State. His existence made everyone feel that their life and death and future were all controlled by him. But in the face of that terrifying possibility, even Li Tianlan was a non-entity. Tianlan, can this person be trusted? Dongqing Wudi slowly turned his head to look at Li Tianlan, his eyes extremely solemn. Tianlan, kill him. Bai Zhanfang was silent for a long time before he slowly said. His tone was firm and tough. Kill? Wu Jingmin expressed his attitude without hesitation. No matter what, he has to die. Kill him. Zhou Mulin also said. Boundless killing intent completely surrounded Xianyuan Wushang. Xianyuan Wushang shrugged helplessly. He doesn't have this ability now. Li Tianlan shook his head and said the most important information. After a pause he said again, and he can be trusted. No one spoke. Li Tianlan frowned. Perhaps because he was facing his own people, he did not hide his dissatisfaction. I said he is my brother. Still silence. After a long time, Dongqing Wudi let out a long breath. His eyes were a little complicated. How did you do it? It's a prop. Xianyuan Wushang smiled and said, or you can understand it as me using that prop to temporarily replace the network system of East Island and invade their core database. That prop instantly simulated and analyzed the information of every person recorded in East Island from countless files, and instantly simulated countless personalities. This kind of ability is really scary. In fact, it wasn't just the top officials of East Island who were affected that night. There were a total of 40 million calls in East Island that night, including phone calls, videos, emails, and texts. All of these were intercepted by the special intelligences simulated by that prop. But that prop's ability also reached its limit, so after the battle in Beihai, that prop was also destroyed. What he said was half true and half false. For example, that prop. If he hadn't appeared in front of Li Tianlan with virtual travel and taken Li Tianlan to do another virtual travel, Xianyuan Wushang's glasses wouldn't have been destroyed. That pair of glasses could have allowed Xianyuan Wushang to travel in every corner and scrupulously and invade every secret location at will. Simulating tens of millions of intelligences in an instant was nothing for that pair of glasses. It was nothing. But the truth was that the glasses were indeed destroyed, and Xianyuan Wushang really didn't have the ability that made everyone so afraid. A prop? The giants in the study looked at each other for a while. Where did that so-called prop come from? Wu Jingmin asked in a deep voice. Xianyuan Wushang didn't mind their aggressive attitude and said slowly, it originally belonged to my sister. Later she gave it to me. For me it's the most precious thing. Where's your sister? Zhou Mulin looked serious. Xianyuan Wushang was silent for a while, then said sadly, she's dead. Dongqing Wudi looked at Xianyuan Wushang seriously. His intuition told him that Xianyuan Wushang wasn't lying. He breathed a sigh of relief but also felt a little pity. If it was just a prop, its value would be completely different. What a pity, Wu Jingmin smiled and said, that prop? If it could still be used, it would be enough to be the most important strategic weapon of the country. Even if it could only be used once, it would be a great deterrent. This kind of weapon makes everything developed by other countries meaningless. The more advanced the weapons they develop, the more advanced they create for themselves. Such a value can be said to be far greater than a murderous weapon. Xinyuan Wuxiang twitched the corner of his mouth. He subconsciously wanted to say that it was nonsense, but he held back. The murderous weapon of Miracle City was something he had always paid attention to, so he also knew some information. Obviously, when people here found King Wei, he was in an absolutely weak and seriously injured state. Even his consciousness was about to dissipate, leaving only a little instinct. With King Wei's particularity in the real environment of Miracle City, his injury could only get worse and worse, without any possibility of recovery. The so-called hermit family that first found King Wei had been guarding his body. No one knew how many years had passed before the Wang family of Beihai destroyed the hermit family and found the prestige that was on the verge of death. Countless high-tech devices were used at the same time, and finally King Wei's body and murderous weapon were barely decomposed, turning into the carefree and murderous weapon of today. At present, even if King Wei's body was reunited, he was still seriously injured and could die at any time. His power was completely incomparable to that of his heyday. But even so, once King Wei's body was reunited, his energy should be able to barely form a small circulation around Li Tianlan. With the supplement of Li Tianlan's sword energy, his energy could be self-sufficient. Its power was at least countless times stronger than that of ruthlessness at its peak. When Li Tianlan returned, King Wei in his heyday would be equivalent to the existence of the peak energy source. This was the only weapon that occupied the throne in the corridor of time and space over the incomparably long years. It was the weapon of the first emperor. If King Wei hadn't died with Li Tianlan, the current corridor of time and space might have been King Wei to take the position of King of War. Compared to King Wei, the little tool in front of him was nothing. Is there any more of such a prop? Bai Zhanfeng asked slowly. Xinyuan Wuxiang shook his head. No. The giants all breathed a sigh of relief. Some were glad but also disappointed. Their moods were extremely contradictory. That is to say, without that prop, no one in the world can invade at will like you, right? Dongqing Wudi asked. Xinyuan Wuxiang thought for a moment and grunted. Such people actually existed. The strength of Lin Shi's apostle was no less than that of his sister. If he did it himself, the effect would be many times better than that small prop. But he could indeed do it. Obviously, they were now being targeted by the eldest princess. Under such circumstances, the most he could do now was to search for information and occasionally use virtual shuttle to escape for his life. The dignified apostle, whose destructive power was almost invincible among his peers, could only escape for his life and search for information. The corners of Xinyuan Wuxiang's mouth curled up slightly. He was somewhat gloating. That's the end of this matter. Dongqing Wudi said slowly, Tianlan, don't publicize this matter. It can't be explained clearly. As long as he is around you, it will cause others to be afraid, which is not a good thing. No one will believe that he can only use that ability once. As long as he is around, you will be in trouble. Such a person is a real devil in the eyes of his opponents, but in the eyes of his own people, he is equivalent to an angel. Once this kind of trouble is publicized, it may cause very bad results. Devil? Angel? Xinyuan Wuxiang laughed. In fact, my greatest wish is to be an angel. Unfortunately, at least so far, I haven't seen any hope of becoming an angel. Bai Zhanfeng obviously didn't like Xinyuan Wuxiang. Seeing that the fat man was serious, he snorted and said grumpily, why don't you say you want to be a god? God is the human definition of a powerful creature beyond the scope of understanding. This term is strictly abstract. In a sense, it doesn't exist. Even if it exists, a god may not be stronger than an angel. So you recognize an angel, but refuse to recognize a god. Li Tianlan suddenly added. No one else spoke. Instead, they looked at the two of them as if they were looking at a mentally disabled child. Zhongzhou State had always been a country of atheists. I'm just against the term god. I don't deny certain powers. Angel is just a title. As for a god, I agree with it. But even if it really exists, it shouldn't be called a god. It should be a superconsciousness that is above everything and creates all things. It's something we can't see. Specifically, we have another name for those who are like gods and have absolute power. It's about truth and irreplaceable. We call them. Xinyuan Wuxiang smiled and said softly, Master. Chapter 1083. On the way to the Chen family, The vehicles that set off from the Bai family's manor formed a row of majestic motorcade. The cars chosen by Dongqing Wudi, Zhou Mulin, by Zhan Feng, and Wu Jingmin were all black flags specially made for leaders in Zhongzhou state. Li Tianlan's car was given to him by the master of Samsara Palace in the year of the chaos in Snow Country. It was a custom-made Rolls-Royce which was the only one in the world. Now it became Li Tianlan's car in Yuzhou. 5 cars lined up neatly in the front and back, surrounded by 4 escort cars, all of them Audis, quietly protecting the car in the middle. At the front there were 2 police cars for clearing the way. At this time, including the route from the Bai family to the Qin family, according to the traffic situation in Yuzhou, without police cars clearing the way, they might have to walk until the afternoon. Xinyuan Wuxiang was still Li Tianlan's driver. He held the steering wheel and seemed to be a little curious about this means of transportation. "You haven't driven before?" Li Tianlan asked in surprise. He had long noticed Xinyuan Wuxiang's curiosity about cars, but this interest lasted from the hotel to the Bai family's manor, and then from the manor to here. Li Tianlan couldn't help but despise him. "Bumpkin. Indeed, I haven't driven before." Xinyuan Wuxiang sighed with emotion. "I haven't even seen this thing before. It's too heavy, and it even needs to hold the steering wheel to control the direction. Tut, it's an antique among antiques. If it were here, someone would definitely pay a lot of money to collect it." There was one thing that Xinyuan Wuxiang didn't say. Anything that came from Miracle City, not to mention a car, even a handful of soil had great research value. "What's your means of transportation?" Li Tianlan asked casually. He had always thought that the group behind Xinyuan Wuxiang should be a hidden force living in a corner of a country on Earth. Maybe it was Africa or the west of subcontinent or somewhere else. Isolated from the world, they developed countless black technologies and discovered countless secrets. They closed themselves off from the world and rarely communicated with outsiders. But looking at it now, it didn't seem to be the case at all. No matter how little he interacted with outsiders, he should have seen a car before. Even if he hadn't, he should have seen a similar tractor. Xinyuan Wuxiang's curiosity about this luxurious vehicle wasn't because he was looking at something advanced. His gaze was more like he was admiring an ancient antique, just like how a modern person would look at a chariot from the Preaching Dynasty. He was full of interest, but it was just an interest in collecting. Li Tianlan's expression was somewhat stiff. He could understand this interest, so naturally he could also understand the other meaning behind this interest. Even in modern times, not everyone liked antiques. Xinyuan Wuxiang had this kind of interest, so he liked this Rolls-Royce very much. It was like a normal person facing a bronze chariot with thousands of years of history. The only thought in their mind was, what the F***ck is this rubbish? It's a pile of scrap metal. So backward? Backward. So, were they the bumpkins in Xinyuan Wuxiang's eyes? We can use virtual shuttle to temporarily turn ourselves into data. In the later stage of the development of the quantum network, it is extremely compatible without any lag. The data stream that can be accommodated is beyond everyone's imagination. If we turn ourselves into data, we can go anywhere regardless of distance. Why do we need to use a car? Xinyuan Wuxiang said with a smile. Li Tianlan was a little dissatisfied and didn't believe it. Is something like virtual shuttle as common as bicycles in your world? This kind of technology is high-end anyway. Even if it's ordinary, the so-called quantum network should be your main communication channel, right? Just like the current internet, it turns people into data. If the data is turned into data by a super hacker, can he take advantage of the opportunity of turning himself into data to invade the inside of your quantum network? Don't you have any precautions for such a shuttle? It's not that exaggerated. Xinyuan Wuxiang smiled. But we do have precautions. Even in our world, virtual shuttle is a very high-end technology. But for me and the people around me, we can use it at any time. As for most people, Xinyuan Wuxiang thought for a moment and said, they don't use cars either. His eyes suddenly lit up. Big brother, I remember a few movies here. There's a guy who claims to be comparable to God with a mortal body. His equipment, to a certain extent, is close to our normal means of transportation. If you like, I can get a set of advanced, cutting-edge armor, but it's a little troublesome and takes some time. Li Tianlan thought for a moment, not sure which movie Xinyuan Wuxiang was talking about. After a while he found one that barely matched. You mean the Revenge Alliance? Xinyuan Wuxiang was a little confused. Iron Man? What's the difference? Isn't it just a role? Li Tianlan said grumpily, but his eyes were a little dazed. He had seen the whole series of movies and most of the derivatives mentioned by Xinyuan Wuxiang, but he had watched them with the company of another woman he hadn't heard from for a long time. Wang Yuetong was a die-hard fan of this series of movies. Li Tianlan glanced at them, but the two of them were not very interested in the rich man in iron armor who could fly in the sky and travel underground. Li Tianlan didn't have any special feelings for anyone, but Wang Yuetong admired the captain very much. Li Tianlan thought for a moment and asked, "Your means of transportation is iron armor?" "We call it a single mecha." Xianyuan Wushang smiled. "It has nothing to do with steel. It's a strong interaction material. It can be used as a single person's means of transportation, and it can also be used to arm a small elite army for battle. Well, this kind of thing. I don't think I can carry it." He thought about it seriously and confirmed his idea again. Only a few super-large elite legions would be able to mass-produce individual mechas made of materials with strong interaction forces, making them look like normal equipment. However, even in the space-time corridor, this material was a strategic large-scale military resource. It was a strategic material that could be used for many purposes. All of them were made of protons and neutrons that were completely locked together by strong interaction forces. The surface was absolutely smooth, the temperature was at absolute zero, and it would reflect all electromagnetic waves. Its surface was indestructible, and it had an absolutely strong bearing capacity that far surpassed nanotechnology. This material was not only used to make individual mechas, but it was also one of the main materials used to seal the stars. And the so-called sealing a star, from the perspective of the people on Earth, was the so-called celestial giant structure project. To put it simply, it was the Dyson sphere in the concept of the people here. According to Xianyuan Wushang's understanding of Miracle City, there was currently nothing in any country in the world that could cause the slightest damage to such a mecha. Of course, this so-called nothing didn't include the complete King Wei. If such a mecha was the military version of the time corridor, it was usually equipped with a warp speed engine, image memory system, super thinking system, all-around armed control system, energy conversion resonance system, force field control system, infrasound weapon system, dark matter cannon, and the conventional version of the Star Destroyer cannon. This also meant that such a mecha didn't even need to be operated in the internal space. In the state of super thinking, just the mecha itself could carry out long-distance superluminal cruising and fixed-point teleportation. With the current level of development on Earth, even if Earth developed for 1,000 years, it would still be impossible to face such a mecha alone. Such a mecha could easily penetrate the entire Earth in its absolute speed, as simple as a bullet piercing through a piece of tofu. And any of the weapons equipped on the mecha itself could directly destroy the surface of the entire Earth in just a few dozen seconds. Such a mecha, whether in the time corridor, the God of War's realm, or the human emperor's palace, had a unified name. The code name was Calamity. With Xianyuan Wushang's identity as the ninth prince and a member of the Pinnacle Palace in the time corridor, there was no problem at all for him to get a Calamity mecha. But the point was that if this thing didn't go through special treatment, it would be like a locator in Miracle City, attracting countless malicious eyes. He drove the car, his eyes flashing for a while, but he didn't say anything. Li Tianlan looked at him expressionlessly. "So, when you said you would get me a set just now, you were just making fun of me?" "No, I didn't." Xianyuan Wushang smiled. "I don't have the means to deal with those troublesome things. After all, I'm just a doctor. But I should be able to find someone to get a set for you. Of course, it should be a collectible without weapons and various systems, with only basic navigation capabilities. It's not troublesome." It was indeed not troublesome. He didn't have such a mecha, and neither did Xing Tian. But Lin Shi did. To be exact, it was the apostle next to Lin Shi who had one. He was one of the oldest apostles in the time corridor. If his sister hadn't died, even if he was stronger than him, there would be a limit. How many Calamity mechas did the apostles have? Judging from the size of his sister's army at that time, this type of Calamity grade, fully armed and equipped with different weapons to form a complete set of combat systems, in the hands of the apostles, would be counted in the hundreds of millions. That was the most conservative estimate. If it weren't for the restrictions of the real environment of Miracle City and the eyes of Princess Royal, when the apostles completely released their army, the number of Calamity mechas alone would be more than the total population of Miracle City. And the number of his other armies would be dozens of times more than that. Omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. As the pinnacle of the Order camp, this was the position that the human clan was currently at the limit of this path. It crushed everything at the same level, with the highest lethality and destruction. This was the Apostle of Destruction. It's not bad to get a set to play with. Li Tianlan nodded and said. He wasn't very interested in the mecha himself. It only had basic navigation ability, which meant that it couldn't even be compared to the state in the movies, not to mention the complete state of the mecha. With Li Tianlan's current strength, his physical strength was completely endless. The second heart could support him to squander the power of his dual wind and thunder veins unscrupulously. If Li Tianlan rushed from Yuzhou to Tianan Shenyuan City at full speed, even without Ruthless, it would take him no more than 3 hours on foot. During this time, Li Tianlan even had time to smoke a few cigarettes. This was not Li Tianlan's limit in the future. But it was already the limit of martial arts in the entire dark world. But if he gave this mecha to Qin Weibai, she would probably like it very much. I'll get it for you after a while, big brother. Shenyuan Wuxiang laughed. Li Tianlan nodded carelessly. He had been thinking about the problem that Shenyuan Wuxiang had just mentioned. Their group didn't recognize God. Their disapproval was not a denial of the existence of God. They were just a simple denial of the word. They denied it. They believed that angels stood side by side with the so-called God. As for the power that the gods represented in their minds, they referred to it as Lord. Lord. This was a very profound title. Li Tianlan thought of the Bible. This word often appeared in the Bible. There was a Bible in his bedroom. Qin Weibai was an extremely devout believer. She occasionally prayed, but she didn't go to church. She disdained the Holy Land, but Li Tianlan could clearly feel her devoutness and tranquility. Did the so-called Lord that Shenyuan Wuxiang mentioned also mean this? If this was really what he meant, then Lord really existed? What is Lord? Li Tianlan suddenly asked. He had realized that Shenyuan Wuxiang could say a lot of things, but he couldn't say a lot of things. It depended on how Li Tianlan asked. At least the so-called mecha had already surpassed most people's understanding of technology, and then it made Li Tianlan's thoughts shift to another direction that he felt was a little absurd, a little fake, but it was also very true. Shenyuan Wuxiang hesitated for a moment, then said softly and quickly, "It's the authority." There were only 3 words in this short sentence. If he deliberately sped up, it would take him less than half a second. But what Li Tianlan heard was a chaotic noise. The malice of the world was boiling in Shenyuan Wuxiang's body, destroying countless cells in his body and sucking away the vitality of a large number of organs. Shenyuan Wuxiang's face turned pale for a moment, but there was a touch of eternal pride and arrogance in his eyes that seemed to be eternal and would never yield. Does it have anything to do with the Bible? Li Tianlan took a deep look at him and asked from another angle. Shenyuan Wuxiang was silent for a long time and didn't speak. The Rolls-Royce drove steadily on the road of Yuzhou, followed by Wu Jingmin's Hongqi. When the motorcade drove through a bustling street, Shenyuan Wuxiang let out a muffled groan and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He shook his head slowly and said, "No, it has nothing to do with the Bible. The Lord in the Bible, we prefer to call it the superconsciousness, which is beyond the scope of everyone's understanding. The Lord I'm talking about is like my father and..." He glanced at Li Tianlan and added the second half of the sentence in his heart, "as well as you and Qin Weibai. These things are very interesting." Li Tianlan thought silently. After thinking for a long time, he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Interesting." Shenyuan Wuxiang laughed. His smile was a little bright and a little sad. "It's really interesting, of course it's interesting. To fight with heaven and earth, to stand side by side with heaven and earth, to be the enemy of the world. Survival, no matter when, is the most important thing." Shenyuan Wuxiang murmured to himself. Everyone is trying to survive. This is instinct. Li Tianlan looked at him quietly. Instinct ha, instinct ha. Shenyuan Wuxiang suddenly laughed wildly. He turned his head and looked at Li Tianlan seriously. "Big brother, do you have a goal?" "What do you mean?" Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows slightly. "It's a goal, an ideal, a dream. Whatever you say, it's a height you've been pursuing but haven't reached for the time being." Shenyuan Wuxiang repeated it very seriously. "Goal, ideal, dream," Li Tianlan murmured to himself. After a full 2 minutes he smiled and said, "There should be. I have a lot of goals. A lot. His voice seemed to become soft. "When I was very young, my biggest goal was to be able to eat meat for every meal and let my grandfather drink wine for every meal. When I was a little older, I hoped that I could become strong quickly and walk out of the Li family's camp. When I was a little older, I began to pursue the invincible realm. I hoped to reach that realm as soon as possible because only when I reached that realm could I protect the Li family. When I walked out of the border and met Wang Tianzong, my goal was to be invincible in the world. I wanted to lead the Li family to surpass the previous peak and stand at the highest place." "Well," Li Tianlan smiled and said, That's probably my goal now. Now I can be said to be invincible, but it's not absolute. And the Li family, we don't stand at the highest place. Good goal. Xinyuan Wushang smiled, but there was no smile in his voice. I mean, big brother, if you know that your goal is right in front of you, but you can't succeed no matter what, and you can only work in vain again and again, what will you do? His voice was steady and soft. Li Tianlan raised his head and quietly looked at the little fat man in his sight. There was no expression on his chubby face, but there was a touch of sadness that couldn't be concealed in his eyes. It went deep into his bones. I will persist. Li Tianlan was silent for a long time before he slowly opened his mouth and said, Yes, persist. Xinyuan Wushang said softly, We are also persisting. So, what's your goal? Li Tianlan asked calmly. Survival. Xinyuan Wushang smiled and said, That's our biggest goal. Unfortunately, we're about to fail again. Chapter 1084. For the arrival of Li Tianlan and Dongqing Wudi, although the Qin family tried their best to hide something, they still inadvertently showed strong hostility and great fear. The Qin family's residence was not too far from the city center. It was a Chinese-style garden covering an area of less than 20 acres. It used to be the mansion of a prime minister of the previous dynasty, which matched Qin Fangqing's identity. It was said that Qin Fangqing fell in love with it at first sight. When he was the deputy prime minister, he brought his family here and built the prime minister's mansion into an antique but modern and comfortable Yuan Lin. About 7 years ago, the mansion was bought by Haoyue Group for 1.2 billion yuan. With such an area, the history of the mansion, and the fact that it was in Yuzhou, the price was not too high, but Yuzhou did not suffer a loss. Qin Fangqing's body was currently parked in the main hall of the mansion. When Li Tianlan and the others rushed over, a large number of people came out to greet them. What was rare was that except for Qin Fangqing, the other 8 directors were in Yuzhou. Dongqing Wudi and Zhou Mulin were with Li Tianlan. The remaining 6, including Li Huaqing, all appeared in Li Tianlan's sight at this time. But the one walking in the center was not Li Huaqing. It was a middle-aged man in his early 40s. He looked a little like Qin Fangqing. He was slightly fat and wore a pair of glasses. At this time he was wearing morning clothes. His eyes were a little numb from the pain, and he even looked a little sluggish. Obviously, he had not reacted to the news of Qin Fangqing's sudden death. When shaking hands with Li Tianlan, his arm trembled violently. The almost numb pain seemed to become active the moment he saw Li Tianlan. The pain was changing, mixed with deep resentment and fear. At this moment he looked like he was going to pounce on Li Tianlan and bite him to death at any time. But in the end he dared not do anything. He even quietly lowered his head to hide his eyes. Li Tianlan glanced at him, narrowed his eyes and remained calm. He naturally knew the man in front of him. After Qin Fangqing, he could basically be regarded as the pillar of the entire Qin family. This was Qin Fangqing's biological son and also Qin Fangqing's successor in Zhongzhou State, Qin Shi. A year ago he was just transferred to be the governor of Nanyun Province. This year he had just turned 38 years old. Standing in this position, it could be said that he had a bright future. Moreover, he was transferred to this position a year ago, which was enough to prove Qin Fangqing's good intentions. The election was only about a year away. After the election, whether Qin Fangqing retires or not, the major groups will adjust their existing personnel. Some people will be promoted, some people will be demoted, some people will leave, and some people will stay. Before and after the election, it has always been a time of turbulence. Qin Shi was placed in the position of president a year ago. After the election, just after the red line of 2 years, the Prince Group can completely let Qin Shi take a step forward, leave Nanyun and become the speaker of a province. What was Qin Shi's position in the Prince Group? Judging from his age and position, it was obvious at a glance. Nowadays, Zhou Yuanshan, who was the focus of attention in the new group and was even considered to be very likely to become the president in 10 or 20 years, was 38 years old this year and served as the speaker of Jiangxi province. In the southeast group, Wang Jingxin, who was almost as famous as Zhou Yuanshan, was 36 years old this year and served as the governor of Jianghuai province. Qin Shi was 38 years old this year and served as the speaker of Nanyun province. If everything went well, then after the election, as soon as Qin Fangqing came down, or even before Qin Fangqing retired, Qin Shi's position would change again. Combined with the current personnel structure of the Prince Group, Qin Shi was likely to go to Tianfu province to serve as the speaker, embarking on the road to heaven that Qin Fangqing had walked before, from Tianfu to the southwest, entered the parliament, and finally competed with Zhou Yuanshan, Wang Jingxin, and others for the position of several directors. Zhou Yuanshan, Wang Jingxin, Qin Shi, for such people, if there were no major accidents, their path was destined to be smooth sailing. Perhaps there would be challenges, perhaps there would be setbacks, there would be ups and downs, but in the end they would all reach a dazzling position. What they were fighting for was only a matter of ranking. But now, the big accident really happened. If Chen Fangqing didn't die, even if he retired early, it wouldn't be a big problem. The Chen family might suffer heavy losses, Chen Fangqing's reputation might be ruined, but the Prince Group would certainly protect Qin Shi. His current position and qualifications were perfect. That was the perfection that the Prince Group had spent countless resources to pave. He was one of the core successors of the large group, and now he had reached the position of the provincial speaker, which meant that the internal management of the group couldn't give up on him, nor would they allow him to stumble, because the group didn't have enough time and resources to cultivate other successors. So as long as Chen Fangqing was still there, even if he didn't have any position, Qin Shi would be able to stabilize his position. 1 year later he would go to Tianfu, and 6 years later he would enter the southwest, and the Qin family would once again restore its former glory. But Chen Fangqing died. Very suddenly, without the slightest sign, died inexplicably, and left people at a loss. Qin Shi didn't believe that his father's death was an accident. He spoke to his father on the phone yesterday afternoon after receiving the news of the decisive battle in North Sea. At that time, Chen Fangqing's heart was suppressing great unwillingness and anger, but his attitude was still positive. He had always been in good health. How could he die in less than a day? Li Tianlan. It could only be Li Tianlan. It could only be the new group. Whether or not Qin Shi was rational enough, whether or not he could see that the new group's action at this time was extremely disadvantageous to their own situation, Qin Shi always believed that Li Tianlan killed his father. Because this was the only possible explanation. Since it was the only one, then no matter how absurd it was, the only one was the truth. The moment he saw Li Tianlan, Qin Shi's whole body suddenly fell into great hatred and rage, but when he saw Li Tianlan's eyes, all the hatred and rage seemed to be frozen. The other's eyes were calm and indifferent, like a basin of cold water without the slightest temperature, freezing all the blood in his body in an instant. Fear, coldness seeped in completely into his bone marrow. Only then did Qin Shi remember his identity. Or rather, he remembered his position. His position was the governor of Nanyun Province. Nanyun Province. Nanyun Province was next to Tianan. The rapid development of Shenyuan City in the past 2 years was inseparable from the funds of Emperor Dong's palace and the support of the Flourishing Age Fund hidden behind the scenes at that time. But this was not all. Many plans needed to be discussed in the parliament. Among the large quantities of materials, some of them were strictly controlled. It was not that the Flourishing Age Fund and Emperor Dong's palace could not provide these things, but if they wanted to build a city with the plan of building a province first, they needed all kinds of materials, and they had to rely on the support of Zhongzhou State. All the materials had to pass through Nanyun Province. And the materials for Shenyuan City were also prepared by Nanyun Province first. For more than 2 years, the Prince Group and the academics kept chasing the Southeast Group and the Giant Group, and at the same time, they constantly put pressure on Emperor Dong's palace and the Wang family of Beihai. As the son of Chen Fangqing, Qin Shi sat in the unique position of Nanyun Province. It was completely imaginable what his attitude towards Emperor Dong's palace and what he had done. At least, Qin Shi had secretly heard some rumors. More than one high-level official of Emperor Dong's palace had expressed their attitude that they would kill him sooner or later. At the very least, Qin Shi was on the blacklist of Emperor Dong's palace. If Chen Fangqing had not died, he would have become the master of Heaven's palace 1 year later. Naturally, he would not be afraid of this. But now Chen Fangqing suddenly died. At this moment, Qin Shi finally realized that his position as the successor of the group had been greatly shaken. There were 2 paths in front of him. One was negative and the other was positive. The negative response was naturally to do nothing, expect the counterattack of the group, expect Emperor Dong's palace to fall apart, or expect Li Tianlan to let the Chen family go under pressure. Strictly speaking, Li Tianlan did not have any hatred towards the Prince Group. The outcome of the game was at most a matter of gratitude and resentment, but not hatred. If he lost the game this time, he would naturally have a chance to get it back next time. All his killing intent was concentrated on Chen Fangqing. Today's plunder and suppression of the Prince Group, strictly speaking, had little to do with Li Tianlan's personal will, but the basic demand of the rise of the new group. This demand, in the analysis of many people, could overwhelm everything. Qin Fangqing's death undoubtedly put great pressure on Li Tianlan. Perhaps under pressure for the sake of the new group, he might not do anything to the Qin family. In this way, through the most difficult period, Qin Shi thought that he could rely on his father's death to regain his footing. On this path, the only thing he could expect was that Li Tianlan would let the Qin family go because of the excessive pressure. The positive path was the complete opposite. That was to use the news of his father's death to exert his influence to the extreme and run around. Now the prince group was like a powder keg that would explode at the slightest touch. Everyone had a fire in their hearts that they had nowhere to vent. If he came forward, he was 90% sure that he could completely unite the majority of the forces of the prince group in the shortest time. This force might not be led by him, but it was definitely aimed at Li Tianlan. This was also the situation that the academics hoped to see. Once he did this, the academics would respond to his actions as soon as possible. At that time, the Special Warfare Group and the Southeast Group might join in. They would target Dongqing Wudi, Li Tianlan, and the group behind them and make them make all kinds of compromises. It was easy to succeed on this path. And the so-called success was just to make Li Tianlan compromise. Qin Shi was not sure how far he could make Li Tianlan compromise and not target the Qin family. And once he did so, as the source of all things, the Qin family would inevitably incur stronger hatred from the whole Emperor Dong's palace. This also meant that on this path, he would directly stand at the forefront, on the opposite side of the young Emperor Dong, and directly challenge his majesty. Yes, it was majesty. Qin Shi felt that it was not too much to use this word to describe Li Tianlan. In the eyes of many he was the heavenly son. In the eyes of certain people he was a child. In the eyes of Qin Weibai he was her husband. In the eyes of the people of Emperor Dong's palace, he was his majesty. But in the eyes of all the enemies of Li Tianlan today, the current Li Tianlan was invincible. Invincible in the world, naturally, his majesty was irresistible. Qin Shi wanted to take this path, but he had asked himself countless times, and he still did not feel that he had the courage to stand in front of Li Tianlan. Moreover, even if he really did so, Qin Shi was not sure how many people would speak up for him if Li Tianlan insisted on destroying the Qin family, even if he compromised on a lot of things. As long as Li Tianlan was willing to compromise and give up some resources, then the prince group would have the possibility to choose a new successor. Although it was only a possibility and not an opportunity, it was better than nothing. Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace had grown to this extent. For the prince group, naturally they wanted to get rid of them as soon as possible. But for the Southeast group and the academics, they were happy to suppress the new group in Emperor Dong's palace. But if they wanted to destroy Emperor Dong's palace and the new group, these two groups would definitely retreat faster than anyone else. Therefore, Li Tianlan would always have a position at the top of Zhongzhou state. Many people would suppress him. Li Tianlan would also compromise, but no matter how he compromised, he had to find a target to vent his anger. At that time, when everything was settled, the Qin family would undoubtedly be the most suitable target to be sacrificed. And such a thing was also the most likely. Qin Shi did not dare to do so. But if he continued to wait passively, what would happen after Li Tianlan passed the most difficult period? At that time, the strength of the prince group would be greatly damaged. Qin Shi was one of the successors of the prince group, but not the only one. With the scale of the prince group, it was enough to train 2 future directors of Zhongzhou state, and Qin Shi was just one of them. Just one of them. When the strength of the prince group was greatly damaged in a short time, it was impossible for them to replace both successors. Therefore, giving up one and fully supporting the other was the most rational behavior. Qin Shi would also be given up. Just before and after the election. He would also leave Nanyun. But instead of going to Qianfu, he would go to Yuzhou and be given an idle position. After a few years, when no one paid attention to him, Emperor Dong's palace would also attack him. Qin Shi suddenly found that he had no choice. No matter what choice he made, the Qin family seemed to be facing a dead end. Resentment, unwillingness, fear, coldness, all the emotions turned into a huge pressure, crushing Qin Shi's spine. He held Li Tianlan's hand stiffly, and he did not realize that he had bent down. And in his eyes, there was also a flash of hatred. A vague voice sounded in his ear. It was Li Tianlan's voice, faint, without any emotion, no apparent pain, no apparent pleasure. "I'm sorry for the whole Zhongzhou state, the death of the prime minister is a huge loss." The voice became more and more vague. Qin Shi could not hear it clearly. He held Li Tianlan's hand and his body shook. At noon in the sky full of snow, his body fell heavily to the ground. "Call an ambulance, someone fainted." The Chen family was in a mess and some staff began to make calls. In the noisy atmosphere, Li Tianlan shook hands with everyone in the Chen family in turn. He was expressionless. No one in the Chen family had the courage to look into his eyes. Li Tianlan shook hands with everyone in the Chen family coldly, expressing his condolences. Li Huaqing and other counselors just watched quietly. To some extent, such condolences were a demonstration. Li Huaqing and Hua Xingyang kept their composure. On the side, Guo Wentian's eyes flashed with a blazing and angry light. Zhou Yunhai kept his composure. Wan Qingyun and Ji Wenjiang's eyes flickered, and no one knew what they were thinking. Dongqing Wudi and Zhou Mulin walked in front of Li Tianlan calmly, as if they did not notice Li Tianlan's posture behind them. Until he shook hands with a nephew of Chen Fangqing, Li Tianlan casually shook his hand. A few sword intents rose out of thin air and froze into ice in Li Tianlan's hand. The water drops had been evaporated by the high temperature before they fell from his hand. This blatant action of washing hands embarrassed everyone in the Chen family to the extreme. All the counselors were watching this scene and no one spoke. They all knew what Li Tianlan's action meant. This was tantamount to telling them a problem. The Chen family's business was not over. Was this an expression of determination? Li Huaqing sighed in his heart, looked at Li Tianlan who walked in front of him and reached out to shake hands with him. It's too sudden. Li Tianlan said. Yes, no one was prepared. The Prime Minister has always been very healthy. I just checked the data records of the healthcare doctor for the past 6 months. The Prime Minister's blood pressure has only been slightly high in recent months. Who knows? Li Huaqing shook his head and his eyes were a little complicated. Is this an accident? Li Tianlan looked into Li Huaqing's eyes and asked. Li Huaqing paused slightly and did not speak. This question was too direct. If he said it was not an accident, that meant that he thought Chen Fangqing's death was a murder. If he said it was an accident, that meant that in his attitude this matter had nothing to do with Li Tianlan. No matter what he said, it was not appropriate for Li Huaqing. The forensic doctor is still studying, and it's not clear at the moment. Li Huaqing said vaguely. Li Tianlan nodded. Where is the Prime Minister's body? I also brought a doctor, maybe he can draw some conclusions. Oh. Li Huaqing glanced at Li Tianlan with some playfulness. It's not against the law to look at the body, is it? Li Tianlan said faintly and waved his hand. Shenyuan Wuxiang, who was walking at the back, slightly quickened his pace and stood beside Li Tianlan. Li Huaqing hesitated and nodded. Follow me. Li Huaqing said yes, said goodbye to the other directors and went directly to the main hall. Chen Fangqing's body was lying on a bed, covered all over. Shenyuan Wuxiang glanced at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan nodded. Shenyuan Wuxiang took 2 steps forward and casually lifted the cover on the body. Chen Fangqing's eyes were closed and he looked very peaceful. If you didn't look at the color of his skin, he looked like he was asleep. With his back to Li Tianlan and Li Huaqing, Shenyuan Wuxiang narrowed his eyes. There was an incomparably pure light flowing in his eyes, as if he had seen through everything. The light in his eyes became brighter and brighter. His pupils slowly narrowed, but the expression on his face began to become doubtful. The doubt slowly became dignified and serious, and finally turned into a touch of fear and dread. He stared at Chen Fangqing for almost 5 minutes. He put down the cover again. How is it? Li Tianlan, who had been standing there chatting with Li Huaqing and couldn't do anything else, asked casually. Nothing unexpected. Shenyuan Wuxiang was silent for a long time, and then slowly said, It's a natural death. No one could see his expression. Obviously this was not the truth. But this was the only thing Shenyuan Wuxiang could know. From Chen Fangqing's body he could vaguely feel that something was wrong. This feeling was vague, but his instinct told him that such a death was definitely not a normal death. But the problem was, Shenyuan Wuxiang knew that it was not a normal death, but he didn't know how abnormal it was. He didn't know at all. Chapter 1085. No one believed Shenyuan Wuxiang's words. Just like the forensic doctor's conclusion that Chen Fangqing died of natural causes, no one believed it either. Such a death was too coincidental, and there were great benefits behind such a coincidence. So even if it was a natural death, some people tried to turn it into a conspiracy. Shenyuan Wuxiang was a doctor, but he was unknown and had no authority to prove it. In the eyes of others, his so-called natural death was just a formality that Li Tianlan had brought a person here to go through the motions and give the conclusion of natural death. People didn't even believe that Shenyuan Wuxiang was a doctor. This conclusion couldn't stand scrutiny and no one would believe it at all. But at the very least, Li Tianlan had to show his attitude. As the new group became more and more clear, and people kept changing their positions under the influence of the Flourishing Age Fund, Li Tianlan's attitude could be said to be unimportant, but it could also be said to be very important. But on the scene no one showed any doubt about Shenyuan Wushang, even those from the Chen family. There was an endless stream of people from the Chen family who came to mourn. After all, he was the prime minister of a country. No matter how down and out he was, ordinary people couldn't compare with him. And now most of the people who could get the news were well informed. They could know about Chen Fangqing's death, and naturally they could see some possible developments after Chen Fangqing's death. At this time, no one wanted to offend Li Tianlan, and naturally no one wanted to offend Chen Fangqing. Anyway, it was just a trip and no one thought it was troublesome. On such an occasion, other directors of Zhongzhou State had to show up, but it was not suitable for them to be watched for a long time. So Li Huaqing took the initiative to borrow a side hall from the Chen family and prepared to hold a temporary meeting on the spot. When talking to the Chen family, Li Huaqing's expression and voice were very calm. But Li Tianlan, Dongqing Wudi, and Zhou Mulin all took a deep look at him. Meeting in the Chen family. Everyone knew what it meant. The Chen family was not far from the Hidden Dragon Sea. Under normal circumstances, even if there was a meeting, it should be held in the Hidden Dragon Sea. In fact, they had nothing else to do here. There was no need to stay here after showing up. Chen Fangqing's death was sudden and special. In the past 100 years, he was the first director to pass away before he even retired. Therefore, all the counselors would show up. All the counselors in Yuzhou and the powerhouses of the military headquarters would come here. In the next 3 days, all the counselors in Zhongzhou State would come to Yuzhou and wait for Chen Fangqing's funeral. If Chen Fangqing had already retired, the directors would also come before the official funeral. However, they would not appear at the same time. In fact, not all of them would appear. They would ask the secretary to help maintain the order at the scene. They would only attend the funeral ceremony for Chen Fangqing's remains. So, strictly speaking, after the appearance all the directors had nothing to do. It was enough to leave 2 secretaries to assist the Chen family. They could come again during the funeral ceremony 3 days later. But now, Li Huaqing requested to have a meeting at the Chen family. Was it because the meeting was so urgent that they couldn't even make it from here to the Hidden Dragon Sea, which was less than 20 kilometers away? That was obviously not the case. This was gaining the upper hand by a show of strength. The high-level meeting held in the Chen family had a rich meaning, and the most direct meaning was Li Huaqing's dissatisfaction with Li Tianlan. Holding the meeting here not only put great pressure on Li Tianlan and the giant group, but also showed his attitude to other groups. Li Tianlan was expressionless and didn't say anything from beginning to end. The Chen family specially arranged a relatively quiet room in the backyard for Chen Fangqing. The room was not very big, so it seemed extremely crowded after the high-level people walked in. There were still a lot of people present today. Not only the 9 counselors but also the 3 deputy prime ministers of the cabinet, 2 national advisors, Speaker of Yuzhou by Zhan Feng, 4 deputy ministers of the military headquarters by Qing Zhao, the deputy secretary general, and the counselors of the Ministry of Personnel, the Coalition Ministry and other departments were all present. Li Huaqing sat in the main seat and silently looked at everyone present. Li Tianlan sat opposite Li Huaqing with a blank face. He didn't say a word and his mind was wandering. I just met the Prime Minister yesterday. Li Huaqing was silent for about 5 minutes before he slowly said, "We talked until late. Last night he was still discussing the development of Zhongzhou State with me. Who could have thought that today?" There was an extremely sincere regret and sigh in his tone. No one knew what he really thought. Guo Wentian took out a cigarette and lit it. He said slowly, "We've been communicating a lot recently. The Prime Minister has been under a lot of pressure recently and often suffers from insomnia. His headache is an old problem and he's talked to the doctor about it, but the doctor didn't have a good solution. He just prescribed some painkillers and told him to rest well." Guo Wentian laughed at himself and said, "Pay attention to rest. As far as I know, the Prime Minister's work and rest have been extremely chaotic in recent years, and a lot of things have happened recently. How can he have any rest?" There was silence. The Prime Minister has always been very concerned about the affairs of the cabinet. The Prime Minister's vision has always been very long-term. He pays attention to the future of the cabinet. At the same time, he often reflects on the past of the cabinet, combines the past with the present, summarizes the experience and explores the future road. A few days ago the Prime Minister mentioned to me that the future of the cabinet still needs new ideas, a new atmosphere, and 100 schools of thought contend. Many years ago we vigorously supported agriculture and later we vigorously supported industry. These correct measures have established our position in the world today. In recent years our eyes have been locked on finance and energy. For other fields, there has been a certain neglect, so we have also missed some opportunities. So the Prime Minister feels that after the election, we should promote some talents from various aspects and enrich the breadth of thinking of the cabinet. He said that no field of the country should be abandoned. A cabinet member suddenly said in a calm and unhurried tone. Li Tianlan raised his eyelids and glanced at him, but still did not speak. The speaker was He Jingnan, a cabinet member who had been very low-key in recent years. The so-called cabinet member was theoretically at the same level as the deputy prime minister, but in fact he had great influence but did not compete for the position of deputy prime minister. Strong people had real power in their hands and they also had their own fields. But most of the time they cooperated with the work of the cabinet. In other words, they cooperated with the work of the real master of the cabinet. A few years ago, He Jingnan had been in a state of semi-retirement. After this election he was bound to retire. No one thought that in this matter he would rush out after Guo Wentian to be the vanguard. He Jingnan felt Li Tianlan's gaze and nodded to him, smiling politely and respectfully. He was the backbone of the Prince Group, but he could not be regarded as one of the core members. However, Qin Fangqing died suddenly. In today's Yuzhou he was already a relatively important figure that Guo Wentian could pull out, and Guo Wentian also gave him an offer that he could not refuse. Originally, He Jingnan did not intend to express his position in this matter. The fields he was in charge of overlapped with Wu Jingmin's in many places. In other words, he worked with Wu Jingmin in the cabinet. After Wu Jingmin entered the cabinet, he quickly straightened out the relationship. After experiencing the means of this old fox who had carried the flag for the Li family for more than 20 years, He Jingnan chose to give in. Although he was still in office, he did not have much time to show up in the cabinet. In theory, the situation and rise and fall of the major groups in Zhongzhou state had little to do with him. But his son was now in a critical period. His son was now the mayor of East Mountain Province's Kojima City. Kojima was a vice-governor level city, but the mayor of Kojima was a vice-governor level city. Although it couldn't be said to be low in status, it wasn't too high either. Guo Wentian almost hit his soft spot as soon as he opened his mouth. If this operation was successful, after the election, his son would be transferred to the capital city of Tianfu province to serve as a member of the council and the speaker of the capital city. In this position, if everything went well, it was very likely that he would become the governor of Tianfu province in a single step after 5 years. That was the real core member of the Prince Group. At his age, his son had little chance to become a director, and the Prince Group did not have such resources. But starting from the position of the governor of Tianfu province, as long as he was not too unlucky, his son could basically reach his current height. Whether he became a member of parliament or a member of the cabinet, he could ensure the continued glory of the family. Therefore He Jingnan did not hesitate. He just thought for a few seconds and then promised Guo Wentian that he would fight for him at the meeting. What he said through Qin Fangqing's mouth was very implicit, but everyone was very clear about what he meant. Promote talents from various aspects and perspectives. The sentence was the key of the key. The so-called various aspects and perspectives could be understood as focusing on officials with different talents. But there was no shortage of such different types of officials in the major groups. Even the weakest North group had a lot of them. So this sentence was equivalent to saying that the cabinet after the election was a piece of cake placed in front of the major groups, and everyone had a chance to share a piece. In other words, the next cabinet would no longer be a group with a relative advantage. Instead, every group could make their own voices heard in different positions. This had an absolute conflict of fundamental interests with the future planning of the new group. Wu Jingmin became the second minister. Bai Qingqian became the deputy minister. The goal of the new group was clear and clear. It put its 2 leaders in the cabinet, and even sacrificed a lot of possible local interests for this. The first step of the rise of the new group was to win the right to speak in the cabinet. Now He Jingnan wanted to let the cabinet compete. All the people of the group entered the cabinet, which also meant that the position of the new group in the cabinet would be greatly reduced, and its right to speak would also be greatly weakened. The strategy of the new group would completely fail. At that time, even if Wu Jingmin and Bai Qingqian were pushed up, the new group would only get a small number of positions in a few provinces, and its foundation would become unstable. It was hard to say what the future of such a new group would be, but at least it would be difficult to start. The cabinet's competition was the first step of the Prince Group's plan. In this plan, because there were too many voices from all sides, the authority of the second minister would be weakened to a certain extent, and the main authority would be concentrated on the prime minister. Many contradictions and conflicts needed to be mediated by the prime minister who controlled the cabinet, which further accelerated the speed at which the new prime minister accumulated prestige in the cabinet. The second step of the plan was taken over by the academics. They tried their best to push Hua Xingyang to the position of prime minister, put pressure on the new group and curb his speed of development. The academics would fully support the first step of the Prince Group's plan. The Prince Group would fully support the second step of the academics' plan. The tacit understanding could be said to be flawless. In order to win more support, the prospect of the cabinet's competition was explained in advance, which was to rope in other groups. The cabinet was the core of the country. Each department under the cabinet meant great power, especially the departments of finance, development, security, commerce, agriculture, and industry. Not to mention the position of minister, even the deputy or even the head of some important departments and bureaus, would be fought over. When these positions were held in the hands of the major groups, they would also become some stable promotion ladder, and they were the kind with great value. Such positions, no matter how many there were, no one would complain. Since He Jingnan had said this on behalf of the Prince Group, it was equivalent to a promise from the Prince Group and the academics. Such a promise couldn't be stingy. After all, the major groups had their own dealings and it wasn't a one-time deal. If their reputation was ruined this time, even if it was beneficial in the short term, it wouldn't be worth it in the long term. Therefore, in order to get the leadership of the cabinet, the Prince Group and the academics really planned to divide a considerable part of the cabinet's power. While roping in other groups, they suppressed the new group's plan to conquer the cabinet. Could be said to be killing two birds with one stone. Personally, I think the Prime Minister's words make sense. He Jingnan looked at Li Tianlan and immediately shifted his gaze. He wasn't too afraid of Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan did bring a lot of pressure to people, but no matter how arrogant Li Tianlan was, he wouldn't go so far as to kill his entire family just because of a few words. Everyone present knew this very well. Therefore, he continued to speak, expressing his attitude. It's simply a penetrating insight. I also hope to see a cabinet with diverse thinking. The death of the Prime Minister is a huge loss to Zhongzhou State, but we should unswervingly follow his path. Time will prove that he and we are both right. That is to say, I'm wrong? Li Tianlan suddenly asked. His eyes fell on He Jingnan, his eyes bright and unblinking. In fact, no one mentioned anything about him, but Li Tianlan just took it personally. No one thought he was stupid. He just sat there quietly, but as he spoke, everyone could clearly feel a kind of incomparably cold and stiff pressure. He Jingnan moved his mouth and was about to speak. Li Tianlan suddenly said, "Have you really seen the Prime Minister recently?" He Jingnan was dumbfounded. Everyone's eyes shifted to him. At this juncture, He Jingnan could not take half a step back no matter what. He braced himself and nodded, saying naturally, Of course. I don't believe it." Li Tianlan said lightly, "I don't believe the Prime Minister would say this to a dispensable cabinet member like you. It's not essential." This was an understatement, but in He Jingnan's ears, it had the effect of killing people. He Jingnan's face suddenly turned red. But before he could explode in anger, Li Tianlan had already continued, "I will send someone to investigate this matter. Your specific whereabouts these days will soon be investigated. Here, today you can say whatever you want, even in the name of the Prime Minister. But today everyone is sitting here. If you haven't seen the Prime Minister, it is tantamount to deceiving the entire Zhongzhou State. At that time, even if Zhongzhou State does not touch you, I will make you pay the price." He Jingnan's body stiffened. His snow-white beard trembled and his face was a little pale. "Your Majesty is really domineering," Hua Xingyang suddenly said with sarcasm. Li Tianlan glanced at him. Whether it was He Jingnan or the Prince Group, they were important, but they weren't absolutely important. Everyone knew that whether the new group could conquer the cabinet or not had a direct and absolute relationship with whether Hua Xingyang could become the new Prime Minister. He was the biggest obstacle on the way to the rise of the new group. I don't want to be deceived, especially in the name of a dead man. Everyone is very clear about the Prime Minister's character. He distinguishes between merits and demerits. No one will deny what he has done. Such a person should be respected enough. But if someone uses his death to seek benefits for themselves, then where does the Prime Minister stand? Where does the cabinet stand? I will investigate it clearly and make some people pay the price. I do this to be responsible for Zhongzhou state. Li Qianlan's voice was cold and tough. The conversation seemed to be at an impasse. Li Huaqing silently watched the other people in the room without batting an eyelid. Hua Xingyang's eyebrows twitched slightly. He wanted to say something but he held back. Li Qianlan's words were equivalent to the most naked threat. He was not only threatening He Jingnan. It was also Hua Xingyang. He Jingnan spoke in the name of Chen Fangqing. Li Tianlan used Zhongzhou state to fight back. Be responsible for Zhongzhou state. Li Tianlan was already qualified to say this. No one present, including Li Huaqing, dared to say to Li Tianlan that Zhongzhou state did not need his responsibility. No one dared to say it and no one could bear such a responsibility. So this extremely tough threat meant that Li Tianlan had forced the academics to the brink of falling out with him. Falling out completely? This was definitely not what Li Huaqing wanted to see. In the silence, Li Tianlan slowly tapped on the table in front of him. His fingers jumped rhythmically on the table and the other hand supported his face. He tilted his body and looked at He Jingnan. Now I will give you another chance. Tell me, have you seen the Prime Minister recently? He Jingnan's body trembled obviously. He wanted to speak but he lost all his courage for a moment. Li Huaqing frowned and suddenly said, "Okay, we can discuss this matter later. Let's go back to Hidden Dragon Sea and hold a formal meeting." He paused and said calmly, "Huayang, you stay and see if there is anything else the Qin family needs." The Prime Minister left suddenly. "You have to temporarily take charge of the work of the cabinet so that he can leave at ease." Temporarily arrest him? Was this temporarily really temporary or? Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows and showed a sneer. "Li Huaqing, did you want to set the tone directly?" Ji Wenjiang and Wan Qingyun also raised their heads at the same time, looked at each other and wanted to speak. But Li Tianlan had already beaten them to it. "I'm different." He didn't finish his words either. It was because at the instant he spoke, cries of grief suddenly sounded from within the Qin clan. Wails of despair and misery filled the air. Such a sound was very common in the news of Chen Fangqing's death. However, the voice that had suddenly appeared seemed to have been magnified thousands of times in an instant. Li Tianlan was stunned. The next moment, the door of the temporary meeting room was suddenly pushed open. Li Huaqing's secretary Ma Si rushed in a panic. Behind Ma Si, the secretary of Hua Xingyang and Wu Jingmin also rushed in. "President, everyone." Ma Si's breathing was a little short and his face was extremely ugly. When he spoke, he subconsciously looked at Li Tianlan, with a touch of fear in his eyes, avoiding eye contact. Li Tianlan's heart sank for no reason. Ma Si's voice was like an icy wind, blowing quickly through the meeting room and into everyone's heart. "Just 2 minutes ago in the ambulance," Ma Si said in a dry voice, "Governor Qin, she passed away, the cause of death. Cerebral hemorrhage." There was a dead silence. Li Tianlan's body stiffened in place. His face became completely livid. Chapter 1086. The crowd hurried, and the huge mansion of the Qin family was completely shrouded in a desperate and tragic atmosphere. The male relatives of the Qin family could barely support their bodies to receive the guests, but the women had completely lost their souls. There was no more sorrow, no more crying. Everyone sat in the morning hall in a daze, like puppets placed in the morning hall. A brand new morning hall belonging to Qin Shi was quickly set up. The number of people who came to the Qin family increased in less than 2 hours after Qin Shi's death. The news of the death of the father and son of the Qin family spread from the temporary conference room. The resolution had been formed, the documents were sent to various places, and the major media software pushed the news at the same time. At this time, almost all of Zhongzhou state had known that the Prime Minister and Qin Shi died on the same day. Li Tianlan was still the biggest suspect. Chen Fangqing's death shocked people and Li Tianlan's madness. But Qin Shi's death made almost everyone angry. It was too much. Everyone felt the same way. Li Tianlan was challenging the most basic bottom line that the whole Zhongzhou state had formed for hundreds of years. Killing the Prime Minister, killing the governor, if he could get through this safely, who would he not dare to kill in the future? Status was meaningless, position was meaningless, power was meaningless, and everyone in the whole Zhongzhou state would be shrouded in the shadow of Emperor Dong's palace. Would such a Zhongzhou state still be Zhongzhou state? Not anymore. The answer was yes. Not anymore. Such a Zhongzhou state was a cage. Perhaps no one would sympathize with Chen Fangqing and Qin Shi, but when they got the news, countless people started to unite and began to resist Li Tianlan. Power and the privileged class were unpopular in the eyes of most people, but they must exist. This was the most stable part of the order. Such stability was magnified to some extent, and became one of the sources of social stability. When the so-called privilege and power were killed by people who ignored the rules, regardless of the impact, such people became lunatics in the eyes of everyone. A lunatic who must die. The news of the death of the father and son of the Qin family was like a thunder, arousing endless killing intent and hostility. The most obvious and the first thing to show was the number of people who came to the Qin family to offer their condolences. The deputy speaker of Yuzhou province arrived first. Nobody thought too much about the deputy speaker who had the background of Special Warfare Group. Closely after that, the deputy mayor of Yuzhou province, the director of the development committee and the deputy minister of the Ministry of Personnel arrived. Everybody sensed something unusual. The patriarchs of the rich and powerful families brought their core members to pay a visit. Some of these patriarchs were close to the Prince group, some to the North group and some to the Giant group. But all of them came. They remained silent, expressing their support for the Qin family in silence. The meeting in the temporary conference room continued. Li Huaqing, who had originally planned to move the venue, once again chose to continue the meeting after hearing the news of Qin Shi's death. Li Tianlan did not come out again. But everyone could imagine how fiercely Li Tianlan, even Dongqing Wudi, Wu Jingmin, and the others were suffering now. The meeting had been going on for nearly 5 hours. The sky had already darkened and night had fallen. The mansion of the Qin family was bustling. A large number of officials gathered here. After coming here, except for those who had urgent matters, they were not in a hurry to leave. Even if a few left, they left their secretaries here. More and more people came to the Qin family. After dinner, these people still gathered in twos and threes, occasionally glancing at a certain corner. In that corner, the chubby Xianyuan Wuxiang, who did not look aggressive at all, was sitting there silently, with a cup of cold tea in front of him. Xianyuan Wuxiang's expression was even gloomier than Li Tianlan's. Every few seconds, the gazes from every corner would sweep past him, intentionally or unintentionally, with disgust and disgust that they wanted to hide but couldn't. Xianyuan Wuxiang knew very well that this disgust was because he came with Li Tianlan, and people all knew that he was Li Tianlan's driver. If they treated him like this, how much would they feel about Li Tianlan now? These people discussed Li Tianlan. As time passed, almost the entire Zhongzhou state hated Emperor Dong's palace. It was said that several counselors from other places had now arrived in Yuzhou and were on their way to the Qin family. Obviously, the meeting that had lasted for several hours was no longer an impromptu meeting. Qin Fangqing and even all the high-level members of the council were really angry, and they planned to discuss a clear result today. Xianyuan Wuxiang did not want to think about what such a result would be, but he was very clear about it. He knew that this time he was in big trouble. If Qin Fangqing's death was a huge trouble for Li Tianlan, then with Qin Shi's death on the same day, this trouble had now evolved into a near-fatal crisis in just a few hours. To Li Tianlan, Emperor Dong's palace and the Giant group. If this matter was confirmed, then it was no longer a question of how the strength of the new group would shrink. It was no exaggeration to say that this was a question of whether Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace could continue to exist. No, this was no longer a question. Because Zhongzhou state could not allow such a thing to exist. And such a thing did not even need to be confirmed. The current situation was that everyone was suspecting Li Tianlan. When everyone thought it was Li Tianlan who did it, then it didn't matter who the real culprit was. Zhongzhou state's patience had obviously reached its limit. Xianyuan Wuxiang didn't know how much time he had left. Maybe 1 day, maybe 3 days, maybe a week, but no more than half a month. During this period, if Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace could not come up with enough evidence to prove their innocence, then the entire Emperor Dong's palace would be completely destroyed, and Zhongzhou state would do everything to kill Li Tianlan. Without any hesitation, without any apprehension, at all costs. As long as Zhongzhou state made up its mind, Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace must die. This was a fact that did not need to be stated. It was very simple. If Li Tianlan was alive, then every high-level official in Zhongzhou state would face the irresistible threat of death. Therefore, the capital of a nation Yuandu would be fully used to kill Li Tianlan and erase everything related to him. Poison gas, bombing, surprise attack, assassination, seduction, even war, even nuclear war. Emperor Dong's palace did not have nuclear weapons, and their biggest deterrent was Li Tianlan himself. When Zhongzhou state made up its mind to eradicate Li Tianlan, they would not hesitate to take out all their trump cards. Li Tianlan was very destructive. Then they would surround him with a crowd. 100,000, 200,000, 500,000, 1 million, 2 million. The army was endless and all kinds of high-tech weapons emerged one after another. This was not an exaggeration. If Li Tianlan could not prove his innocence, Zhongzhou State would inevitably do so. As long as there were people alive in Zhongzhou State, they would do so. At that time, the so-called new group would become a joke, Emperor Dong's palace would become ruins, and Li Tianlan would inevitably die. This was something that needed no doubt. And with Li Tianlan's death, the entire giant group would also embark on the old road that once happened in another miracle city. Dongqing Wudi by Qingqian Zhou Yuanshan, Dongqing Qiuqi by Zhanfang by Qingzhou. Everyone would be liquidated. Xinyuan Wushang took a deep breath. Compared with the urgency of the situation, he felt more humiliated. He could feel that something was wrong with Chen Fangqing's inexplicable death. But after thinking about it for an afternoon, he had no idea what was wrong or how to prove it. As for Qin Shi, he once wanted to get close to Qin Shi's body, but he was stopped by all the Qin family members with red eyes. The situation was already very dangerous. In this situation, if Zhongzhou State attacked Li Tianlan fiercely enough, maybe by tomorrow Wu Jingmin or Dongqing Wudi would take the blame and resign. And this was just the prelude to the decline of the giant group and Emperor Dong's palace. Xianyuan Wushang suddenly stood up. He walked to a corner, took out his mobile phone and dialed a number. The phone rang twice and was quickly connected. Xing Tian's steady and heavy voice sounded on the other end of the phone. Your Highness. How did Qin Shi die? Xianyuan Wushang asked. There was a silence on the other end of the phone. 2 seconds later, Xing Tian's heavy voice sounded, I don't know. Then changed from not knowing to knowing. Try. I want the information of the mastermind, even a clue. Xianyuan Wushang's voice was extremely cold and ruthless. If necessary, you can die. Okay. Xing Tian's voice was simple and honest, without any hesitation. Xianyuan Wushang paused and continued, and don't investigate the cause of Chen Fangqing's death. Xing Tian was a little confused. Chen Fangqing's death makes me feel very uneasy. I don't know why, but when I look at his body I feel fear. I can't see Qin Shi's body now. I just looked at it from a distance. That feeling doesn't make me feel uneasy, but it makes me very annoyed, very annoyed. Xing Tian was silent for a while and said softly, I'll start investigating now. Xianyuan Wushang said that he could die if necessary, but from his words, Xing Tian clearly sensed something different. Because Xianyuan Wushang felt different. This feeling was worth relying on. The different feeling meant that the people who killed Qin Shi and Chen Fangqing might not be the same group of people. If he investigated the cause of Chen Fangqing's death, he might die instantly. But investigating Qin Shi might not be the case. Xing Tian silently hung up the phone. The wind and snow were still blowing outside the window of Yuzhou. It had been snowing for a day, and the whole of Yuzhou was covered in a cold, silvery white. Xing Tian stood in front of the window for a while, then slowly turned around and sat on the sofa. His huge body seemed to have become absolutely quiet the moment he sat down. Breathing, heartbeat, everything became inaudible. Xing Tian reached out and grabbed something in the air. The air twisted in his hand and finally turned into an incorporeal brush in his palm. He grabbed again with his other hand. The air seemed to have been pulled down by him, making a crisp sound. It sounded like he was tearing off a piece of paper with a slight force. The air with some irregular edges was casually placed on the table. Xing Tian held the incorporeal brush and stared at the incorporeal paper on the table. He was a calligrapher. In this field, he had the ability to see some things clearly. For example, the cause of Qin Shi's death. Xing Tian slowly put the brush down and slowly drew a line on the incorporeal paper. The incorporeal tip of the brush swept across the incorporeal paper, leaving a light red line. Xing Tian thought for a while and wrote 2 words on the paper. 6 years. Before he finished writing the 2 words, the incorporeal red line disappeared. Xing Tian was stunned. He knew that the starting point he was looking for was Li Tianlan, but Li Tianlan couldn't be the starting point. He drew another line and wrote down 2.5 years. The light red line appeared steadily on the paper. The tip of the brush began to tremble. Xing Tian wrote a line. Qi Mulan died. In the blink of an eye, countless densely packed words suddenly covered the empty piece of paper. Before Xing Tian had time to take a look, the handwriting disappeared completely. Xing Tian was a little depressed, but he had to try another way. He took the brush and didn't plan the time. Instead, he randomly found a starting point and wrote, I ate 5 caddies of rice last night. Countless versions of himself began to emerge. It was like countless options neatly arranged. The rice came from Thailand. The rice came from Zhongzhou State. The rice came from... Countless places appeared in front of Xing Tian. The option of the rice came from Zhongzhou State glowed red. Xing Tian clicked on the option that glowed red and wrote another sentence. It tastes good. The dense handwriting seemed to be Xing Tian's thoughts that had been imprinted. Xing Tian's whole person became completely quiet. When everything went smoothly. Under his control, the brush in his hand quickly continued to write. At this moment his huge body began to fade slowly. The light in the room dimmed. His figure became fainter and fainter and finally became a shadow. The shadow was still constantly thinning, and finally became a shadow without a head. And the shadow without a head kept writing something on the paper. His writing speed was even more exaggerated than a computer-generated file. In the blink of an eye, dense handwriting had appeared in front of him. Xing Tian entered the real state of unconsciousness. On the incorporeal paper, the content appeared chaotically and clearly. I ate 5 caddies of rice last night and it tasted good. His Majesty attached great importance to us, so he informed the kitchen to buy more of this kind of rice. The origin of the rice came from Longjiang, Zhongzhou State, and the kitchen stock was running out. The kitchen supervisor went to the supermarket in Shenyuan City to buy and encountered a small car accident on the way. His Majesty took us to Yuzhou. The Ritz-Carlton Hotel was very luxurious. The front desk lady did not look very good. His Majesty and His Highness entered the Hidden Dragon Sea. Chen Fangqing's spirit was in an extremely unstable state. Xing Tian was still writing, but the content had become a wavy line. Xing Tian himself did not notice this scene. The content of the handwriting continued. Chen Fangqing saw Wu Jingmin. His consciousness was chaotic, and his spirit was in a relaxed state. The two majesties arrived at the hotel smoothly and received the room card from the front desk lady on duty. The front desk lady was in a very bad mood. Her father was a truck driver who worked in Nanyuan all year round, responsible for transporting supplies from Nanyuan to Ningbian and Shenyuan City. But her father had a car accident in Shenyuan City today. She had a deep hostility to the two majesties from Tianan. A young man came to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and saw the front desk lady on duty. Xing Tian's handwriting suddenly paused. Bang! In the slight sound, the brush in his hand and the paper in the void instantly exploded. Xing Tian, who had become a phantom, instantly turned into a huge corpse. A mouthful of blood sprayed directly from his mouth. He opened his eyes. His eyes flickered with a touch of shock. He was originally calculating the cause of Chen Shi's death, but after entering the real state he was cleverly misled. The direction of his investigation seemed to point to Chen Fangqing. There was a touch of shock in Xing Tian's eyes. The blown-up paper was pieced together in front of him. He looked at the words that had been written and frowned. It was not because there were too many words on it, but because there were too few words. There was a very interesting saying in the Miracle City that a butterfly in the tropical rainforest of the Amazon River in South America could cause a tornado in Texas 2 weeks later with an occasional flap of its wings. This was the very famous butterfly effect. This was a strange chaotic phenomenon, but it was limited to one system. Xing Tian was a calligrapher, and his ability was more comprehensive. He could cross multiple systems in all directions. Starting from a small thing, it formed a huge chain reaction. There were countless explanations to explain the cause of Chen Fangqing's death from this aspect. Now there were billions of people on the earth, so there might be billions of explanations for Chen Fangqing's death. These explanations were correct to a certain extent, but not completely correct. From the perspective of the butterfly effect, Chen Fangqing's death might be because a beggar in Zhongzhou State sneezed, or it might be because a group of Star State high school students made a beautiful 3-point shot. These reasons were real and objective. They were right and wrong. Xing Tian looked at the paper silently. What would happen if he continued to write on this paper? He started with the dinner he cooked as a starting point, and then found lines that could be constantly developed and changed. For example, the kitchen supervisor had a small car accident. For example, Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai arrived in Yuzhou and returned to the hotel. For example, Chen Fangqing met Wu Jingmin. For example, the receptionist of the hotel was the daughter of a truck driver. These were 4 things, but if he continued, each of them had infinite development possibilities. The receptionist might have a relative who was an official, and he wanted to help the receptionist solve the problem. Chapter 1087. It was quiet in the luxury suite of the hotel. But Qin Weibai's mood was always up and down. All kinds of emotions were brewing in her heart, making her feel complicated. She was a little worried but not like it. She was happy but not like it. She was anxious but not like it. She was looking forward to it but not like it. Her body was still soft after being tossed and turned all night. That kind of extreme joy and satisfaction slowly dissipated, replaced by obvious sleepiness. All kinds of emotions kept emerging, seeming right but not right, making Qin Weibai feel a little confused. She felt as if something was going to happen, but she didn't know what it was. During this period she seemed to think of something. She put on her clothes and went downstairs with a blush on her face. She bought something from a nearby pharmacy and came back to try it, confirming that she was not pregnant. That was to say, her current mood had little to do with Li Tianlan's love for her day and night in the past month or so. But this kind of uneasy mood had a lot to do with Li Tianlan. Qin Weibai didn't tell anyone. She had never dreamed of Li Tianlan in her dreams since she was a child. This statement was not very exact, but it could be said to be accurate. In the trance, she had dreamed of many scenes related to Li Tianlan, but that feeling made Qin Weibai feel like she was watching a movie about the past. In those dreams there was Li Tianlan. But it was not Li Tianlan in reality. Li Tianlan's figure in the dream had always been vague. Even if he appeared beside her in the dream, Li Tianlan was just a shadow, an erratic shadow. In Qin Weibai's dream, Li Tianlan's clothes, face and temperament changed thousands of times every second. The changes were so drastic that in Qin Weibai's consciousness, Li Tianlan in the dream had no facial features, and he was even a shadow without a body. But every time she saw that shadow, Qin Weibai's consciousness in the dream would tell her that it was Li Tianlan. She in the dream also believed it. She and the master of Samsara Palace, who was in Warefree Heights now, were really the same person. They had the same consciousness, the same habits and the same thoughts. At a short distance, the two of them could share the hurt with each other or bear it alone. At a distance, their thoughts were completely synchronized. Both of them knew what the other was thinking all the time because it was their own thoughts. At a further distance, their dreams were completely synchronized. To be exact, when the master of Samsara Palace was in the southern hemisphere, and Qin Weibai was in the northern hemisphere, when they were resting at the same time, their dreams were completely identical. Therefore, for the current Qin Weibai, Li Tianlan was a ghost that had been lingering in her consciousness since she was a child. She kept synchronizing with the master of Samsara Palace and eventually became the same person. They had the same thoughts, so naturally they had the same feelings. Therefore, there was no obstacle for her to accept Li Tianlan. But she had always been confused. She loved him so much and was willing to give everything for him. But why was Li Tianlan just a shadow in her dream? More than 2 years ago, after the Eternal Sword of Mormons, the shadow that belonged to Li Tianlan, which was constantly changing every moment, began to appear more and more in Qin Weibai's dreams. Qin Weibai knew what was going on. This was the master of Samsara Palace's entrustment. In the past, Qin Weibai would also dream, but the source of Li Tianlan in her dreams was the master of Samsara Palace. Now the illusory shadow representing Li Tianlan frequently appeared in her dreams because, in a sense, the other Li Tianlan was already dead. She might not be completely dead, but she was definitely not alive in her current state. So Li Tianlan began to appear suddenly in her dreams. He appeared more and more often, but the shadow became more and more blurred. The master of Samsara Palace broke through the transcendent realm in the spiritual field in the Eternal Sword. Now Qin Weibai was improving every moment. There was no obstacle for her to enter the so-called transcendent realm. Before she went to the desert prison, she had been close to the so-called extreme realm in the spiritual field. Therefore she consciously built a garden in her dream. A garden where sunlight and flying snow danced together. That was her most hidden territory and the starting point of all her dreams. Qin Weibai's only regret was that there was no Li Tianlan in that garden. She even thought more than once that if she could completely connect her consciousness with Li Tianlan's and form a certain degree of thinking synchronization, then in her dreams, could she also bring Li Tianlan into that garden and let their dreams be completely connected? In this way, even if she was not by his side in the future, she could see him in her dreams. It was not him in her imagination, but the real consciousness of Li Tianlan in her dreams. If she let him bully her in her dreams, she would not let him be so gluttonous and unrestrained as he was now. She really thought about this problem seriously. Then she saw Li Tianlan in her dreams. Li Tianlan in his youth. The ancient tree, the wind and snow, the dense sword marks, the boy, and the wooden sword were not things in Qin Weibai's dreams. There was only the garden in her dream, which was the source of the dream. In the source, if Qin Weibai didn't want her dream to expand freely, she could make herself stay in the garden and see nothing out of the control of her spirit. But in such a state she actually saw Li Tianlan. This was obviously an unusual scene. But why would such a situation occur? The teenager Li Tianlan in the dream was extremely clear and real, just like the child who really lived in Qin Weibai's dream. Qin Weibai woke up at that moment. But when she woke up, she still felt that the child was still living in the snow beside the garden. The ancient tree had collapsed, but he seemed to know nothing and still sat there quietly. That feeling was unparalleled. Qin Weibai could be sure that it was not Li Tianlan constructed by her consciousness. The Li Tianlan she constructed with her consciousness was just a faint shadow. He was not a teenager, and even his figure was extremely vague. And not to mention that she had not reached the transcendent realm. Even if she had really entered the transcendent realm, she could not merge her consciousness with Li Tianlan's to form synchronization in the dream. This kind of thing, according to Qin Weibai's understanding, could only exist in fantasy, and it was just fantasy. So who was the teenager in her dream? Qin Weibai was a little uneasy. She carefully recalled the garden in the dream. The flowers were bright, the sun was bright, and the snow was cold. The teenager outside the garden was quiet and plain. It was a very beautiful picture, but it was so beautiful that it was not lively at all. Qin Weibai suddenly felt an indescribable sense of strangeness and horror. It was normal for her to recall every scene in the dream. But the more she thought about it, the weirder she felt. That kind of deeply hidden weirdness was originally completely hidden, but with the appearance of the young Li Tianlan, all the abnormalities were revealed little by little. Qin Weibai sat on the bed and wrapped herself in the quilt. The flying snow crossed the sky through the opened curtains. Without Li Tianlan, the bedroom suddenly became very cold. She sat quietly like this. She didn't eat at noon. As time went by, she became more and more sleepy and began to struggle with her eyelids, but she always forced herself to hold on. At the thought of the teenager Li Tianlan in the dream, she felt a little scared and even dared not sleep. However, the extreme mental fatigue caused her consciousness to become deeper and deeper, deeper and deeper. Qin Weibai's body slid from the sitting position little by little. She lay down again and fell asleep again in a daze. It was still the bright and colorful garden. But the sunshine in the sky disappeared. The snowflakes were scattered and dancing. Qin Weibai stood where she was, feeling the gloomy sky in the dream, and understood that it was because she was too tired now. The flowers in the garden swayed slightly in the wind and snow. Qin Weibai stood stiffly in the garden in the dream, looking straight ahead. She even dared not turn her head. From her position, as long as she turned right, she could see the gate of the garden. If the teenager was still there, she might see the teenager Li Tianlan first. Qin Weibai on the bed breathed unsteadily and frowned. In the dream she was already extremely nervous. The wind and snow in the air seemed to be much fiercer. In the dream Qin Weibai clearly felt the cold. She kept taking deep breaths several times before she controlled herself to slowly turn her head. The first thing that came into her sight was not the gate of the garden, nor the teenager Li Tianlan outside the gate. Instead, it was a thick and old tree that blocked out the sky and the sun but was completely black. The dark giant tree stood outside the gate of the garden. In the wind and snow, the trunk, the treetop, the leaves, everything was quiet and almost dead without the slightest tremor. Qin Weibai's body was cold, and her heart kept sinking. It seemed to be the giant tree that she had seen before that had collapsed. However, when he entered the dream for the second time, the tree had returned to its original appearance. No, it seemed that many years had passed in the dream. Not only did the tree return to its original appearance, but it had also become even stronger. The entire tree had also begun to turn dark and deathly still. There was no teenager under the tree, no wooden sword. There was emptiness. Qin Weibai breathed a sigh of relief. The moment her nervous mood relaxed, she suddenly froze again and looked carefully at the giant tree. Countless snowflakes fell under the crown of the giant tree, but the distribution of the snowflakes was somewhat different. There was a small area where the snowflakes seemed to be floating quietly. It seemed that there was something invisible there that supported the snowflakes and did not let them fall. Qin Weibai looked at it quietly. She looked for a long time before she finally confirmed that there seemed to be an illusory figure that had almost completely become nothingness there. He stayed there indifferently. If she did not look carefully, she could not find him at all. Qin Weibai breathed a sigh of relief in her heart. She knew that she dreamed of Li Tianlan again. In the case of extreme mental exhaustion, the control of the source of the garden was loosened. She dreamed of Li Tianlan at the source of the dream. The Li Tianlan in her dream was this shadow, which was changing every second and was almost transparent. After all, it was something in her consciousness. The coldness in Qin Weibai's heart slowly dissipated. She walked over briskly. In her dream, the Li Tianlan in her dream could do a lot of things. But this time, the illusory shadow that seemed like it would dissipate at any moment did nothing. He sat quietly under the tree as if he was extremely tired and resting, but also as if he was thinking about something. His posture looked a little strange. Qin Weibai looked for a long time before she realized that the shadow's body was a little tilted. This posture seemed to be held in someone's arms. Qin Weibai looked at it carefully. It meant that there was nothing next to the illusory shadow of Li Tianlan. Beside him, there was only the dark giant tree. The dark tree was far thicker than what she saw in the garden. But as Qin Weibai walked closer, the state of the giant tree became clear in her eyes. The giant tree in front of her seemed to be torn apart as well. At this time, there were pieces of metal fragments of different colors inserted in the trunk of the giant tree. Qin Weibai couldn't recognize what kind of metal they were, but she could vaguely feel the color of the metal fragments. However, the originally colorful metal fragments were all dim at this time. Dense cracks spread on each fragment, which was shocking. The cracks spread from the roots to countless branches. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even more pieces of metal were densely packed together. The black giant tree was completely torn by the metal fragments. The giant tree was trembling slightly, and the dark and lusterless sap slowly flowed down from the trunk, like pieces of black blood. Qin Weibai's brows were tightly knitted together. The illusory shadow representing Li Tianlan was still sitting there, as if it would dissipate at any time, but it never did. Qin Weibai stopped in front of the shadow and looked at the giant tree behind him. The giant tree trembled more and more obviously, and the black blood seemed to have flowed into a small waterfall. She didn't know why, but Qin Weibai suddenly felt that the tree should be much bigger than what she had seen. The source of her dream was limited, so the tree seemed to have shrunk many times. It was a very natural feeling. She felt that if the tree really existed, it would be almost infinitely tall, and every piece of metal fragment inserted in the trunk would probably be big enough to cover the whole sky. The tree and the fragments were infinitely shrunk. Only the size of the shadow was ordinary. Black blood flowed down from the trunk as if to completely drown the shadow. However, a powerful aura blocked all the black liquid outside. It seemed to be a sword energy. Qin Weibai was a little confused. When she walked out of the garden, the dream had already unfolded from the source. She didn't know why she had such a dream. The giant black tree was very close to her. Qin Weibai could clearly feel countless emotions from the patches of black blood. Bloody, cruel, evil, chaotic, violent, resentful. Dark and gloomy. The metal fragments inserted in the trunk reflected a faint light. The light was absolutely cold, with an absolutely complete and perfect law, forming a natural sense of repulsion. Qin Weibai really didn't dare to move for a moment. She suddenly found that whether she was close to the black giant tree or those metal fragments, she would end up horribly. She was only the safest when she was around the shadow. But the shadow itself was the most illusory. Tianlan, in the dream, Qin Weibai called softly. The shadow was silent, motionless, and didn't respond at all. This was different from her usual dreams. Qin Weibai thought about it and did what she used to do in her dreams. This was her dream. Everything in front of her was a continuation of her consciousness. She had absolute authority here. In her dream, Li Tianlan was just a shadow that was constantly changing every minute and second. Qin Weibai would try to focus her attention and her consciousness every time to make Li Tianlan become clear. Such an attempt had never succeeded. But she would keep trying until she woke up naturally. Qin Weibai gently sat next to the shadow and looked at it seriously. She began to concentrate her attention and focus her consciousness. The dream began to shake unstably. This was a sign that she was about to wake up after doing something deliberately in the dream. Qin Weibai looked at the shadow in front of her calmly. The shadow began to become clear in her constant concentration. A shallow, faint outline appeared in the almost transparent shadow. The outline began to have slight edges. A touch of color gradually appeared in her sight. It was purple. The moment the purple color appeared, it began to change into various complex colors. Qin Weibai had long been used to this change. However, this change only appeared for a few seconds today, and then it was completely fixed. The constantly changing color disappeared. A shocking black and red color appeared in front of Qin Weibai. No, it was not black and red. It was a black windbreaker. However, the windbreaker was stained with large patches of blood. The blood was almost smeared on every corner of the black windbreaker, which looked sad and tragic. The smell of blood began to appear in the dream. The black windbreaker with a corner stained with blood became completely clear and did not change. It did not change. Qin Weibai's heart began to sink like crazy, as if falling into an ice cave. Because this time, Li Tianlan's body was also fixed and did not change. More and more black windbreakers began to appear. The bloodstains spread all the way down. But what Qin Weibai saw was only a black windbreaker. In the dream she did not see Li Tianlan's leg. It seemed to be cut by an extremely sharp weapon. One of Li Tianlan's leg had completely disappeared. The wound seemed to have happened not long ago. Hot blood was flowing from the wound, and the hem of the windbreaker was almost completely soaked in blood. The shadow became clearer and clearer. Qin Weibai saw Li Tianlan's other leg. No, it was the other half of the leg. His calf also disappeared and so did his knee. Ghastly white bones and blood spread from his thigh. The surrounding air suddenly became hot and boiling. Li Tianlan's sleeve appeared. The empty sleeve was dancing feebly and blood slowly dripped down from the cuff. His other hand still looked good, but the skin of that arm had turned bluish-gray. Dense metal fragments were stuck in every corner of his arm, tearing his finger joints and tearing his muscles and blood vessels. It was a bloody arm, as if someone had fired thousands of bullets directly at the arm at the same time. The heart-wrenching pain broke out from Qin Weibai's consciousness in an instant. She saw most of Li Tianlan's body. She saw his chest and abdomen. The black windbreaker on his chest and abdomen had long been broken, and dense wounds crisscrossed his chest and abdomen. The blood and white bones stimulated Qin Weibai's nerves wildly. On his chest, Li Tianlan's left and right atriums were completely empty. His two hearts had been taken out and only blood was still flowing. Qin Weibai's body trembled violently. She had tried countless times to make the shadow that represented Li Tianlan become clear, but she never expected that the shadow would be in such a state after it became clear. It was a nightmare that she didn't want to recall in any case. She trembled and raised her head. At this moment, the shadow became completely real. She saw the shadow's head. That was Li Tianlan's head. This shadow was indeed Li Tianlan. One of Li Tianlan's eye sockets was empty and dark. The blood seemed to have completely solidified the moment the eyeball was taken out, and there was another shocking wound between his eyebrows. It seemed to be a fingerprint. It was this fingerprint that pressed between Li Tianlan's eyebrows, penetrated his brain completely in an instant, and cut off all his vitality. Qin Weibai almost suffocated. It was really Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan's corpse. No, to be precise, it should be Li Tianlan's mutilated corpse. It was not even a complete corpse. This corpse, which seemed to have just died or fallen for countless years, sat there quietly. His face was covered with blood, but with a strange calmness and exhaustion. The moment this figure appeared, the giant black tree and the endless metal fragments behind him became completely quiet. The black blood disappeared, the giant tree was no longer shaking, and the metal fragments were no longer reflecting light. All the auras also disappeared, as if all of them had become dormant and chosen to retreat. The mutilated corpse still sat quietly, not looking at Qin Weibai, just quietly looking at the distance in the dream. The world was spinning. Qin Weibai screamed out loud. Not in the dream, but in the bedroom. Her body sat up from the bed in an instant, her eyes red, her face covered with tears, and she looked miserable. Why? Her body trembled violently. Why did I have such a dream? It's not a dream. A soft and ethereal voice rang out beside Qin Weibai. It was soft and pleasant, with a sense of intimacy. Qin Weibai was quiet for a moment. She turned her head. A figure shrouded in light sat quietly on the side of the bed, looking at her silently. Qin Weibai couldn't see her face or expression, but she could only be sure that it was a woman. It seemed that her consciousness was still immersed in the dream. She was stunned for a long time, and the first question was not how the other party came in, but asked with a trembling voice, "If it's not a dream, what is it?" "That is His Majesty Li Tianlan." In the light, the woman said softly, "Whether it is the shadow you saw or the mutilated corpse, they are all," after a pause she said, "they are all his most real state." Chapter 1088. Qin Weibai didn't speak for a long time. A shadow and a mutilated corpse. The most real state. In the halo beside the bed, The voice of the slim figure was clear and sweet. Qin Weibai suddenly felt extremely disgusted and repulsed. Because of the content of that sentence. Li Tianlan's real state. Could it be that the so-called true state was the phantom and the mutilated corpse? She forced herself to calm down and shook her head. I don't believe it, she said in a cold voice. The halo beside the bed fluctuated softly. She didn't speak. For some reason at this moment, Qin Weibai suddenly felt that the woman in the halo seemed to want to get close to her, but in the end she didn't move. The truth is in the dream. Whether you believe it or not, it doesn't change anything. The woman in the halo said softly. She seemed to see the shadow and the mutilated corpse in Qin Weibai's dream. In the slightly swaying halo, Qin Weibai felt a clear pain and sadness. If that is Tianlan's real state, then what is Tianlan now? Qin Weibai stared at the light around her and asked word by word. That is the reality you see. Qin Weibai sneered. We see it? Then what about the shadow in my dream? It is the reality in the illusion. In the halo, the woman's answer was still gentle and without hesitation. Qin Weibai suddenly felt a little cold. With their questions and answers, the whole world seemed to have unknowingly become gloomy. It was as if there was some kind of danger brewing quietly and slowly. Then it would erupt bit by bit, bringing with it a deadly murderous intent. Qin Weibai felt a little dizzy. All the cold air in the air seemed to be circling around the ball of light beside the bed, and then she quietly endured it. The scene in front of her seemed a little familiar, and so did the dizziness in her mind. Qin Weibai was stunned and subconsciously said, "This is the malice of the world?" The slightly swaying light paused for a moment. The woman seemed a little surprised, but then she nodded. "Yes. That is to say, you know Shenyuan Wushang?" Qin Weibai asked again. She thought of some information revealed by Shenyuan Wushang. He said he has a sister. Is that you? No. The woman said softly, but to a certain extent, I can be considered his older sister. You can also say that I am his younger sister. But now I am his aunt. Qin Weibai looked at the soft light in silence. For the first time she realized that her IQ seemed to be a little off. Was she an elder sister, a younger sister, or an aunt? This relationship was absolutely chaotic, but the logic seemed to be very clear. However, from such a relationship, Qin Weibai could not arrange it for a while. Who are you? Qin Weibai asked. The woman seemed to be stunned. She was silent for a long time. If she hadn't found out that something had happened to Qin Weibai, she wouldn't have come here now. This kind of meeting made her feel a little nervous. She did not know how to answer Qin Weibai's question. From a certain point of view, Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai were her parents. But from another perspective they could no longer be considered his parents. I am Feng Qinggu. After a long period of silence, the woman finally spoke. She only said her name softly. Qin Weibai rubbed her forehead. Just like the first time she met Shenyuan Wushang, Li Tianlan didn't have any hostility but felt close to him. She felt the same closeness to Feng Qinggu now, even more so than Li Tianlan felt for Shenyuan Wushang. Feng Qinggu, she whispered to herself. You can call me Qinggu. The voice in the halo murmured as if it was acting coquettishly. Qin Weibai wanted to laugh, but she was really not in the mood. She rubbed between her eyebrows like Li Tianlan and said softly, That dream, what's going on? It's a real projection projected in your consciousness. Of course, from your point of view now, it's also illusory. But no matter what the situation is, its existence needs to be affirmed. The temperature in the air seemed to be colder, with a bone-chilling coldness. Qin Weibai knew very well that if this was the malice of the world, then the malice now was many times greater than the malice that Shenyuan Wushang and Li Tianlan had suffered. Because at that time, Qin Weibai only felt a little dizzy, but now she clearly felt the changes in the surrounding space. Real. Illusory. These were the two most common words, but now every time she heard them, Qin Weibai's heart would feel cold for no reason. I don't understand. Qin Weibai hesitated for a moment and said slowly, Can you give me more details? I can't say. Feng Qinggu said softly. But you can ask, maybe I can answer some. Qin Weibai did not know what to ask. Now all her mind was focused on the mutilated corpse and the illusory shadow in the dream. She did not dare to think about what it represented. Did it represent Li Tianlan's future? As soon as this thought popped up, Qin Weibai felt weak all over. Feng Qinggu seemed to know something, but Qin Weibai didn't dare to believe everything she said. But she didn't dare to disbelieve it either. The only topic she could talk about now seemed to be this. In that dream, I dreamed of Tianlan. Qin Weibai wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. That is indeed His Majesty but not the future His Majesty. Although it is not very accurate if we must describe it, it should be the past His Majesty. Feng Qingwu said. Qin Weibai's heart trembled slightly. Her ability to accept things was obviously not comparable to that of ordinary people. With her other self as a living example, she easily thought of a direction that others did not dare to think of. You mean reincarnation and rebirth? There is no such thing as reincarnation in this world. Feng Qingwu said slowly, it's reincarnation, not your Majesty's personal reincarnation, but, Kacha. Feng Qingwu, the voice suddenly disappeared. In Qin Weibai's sight, the empty air suddenly twisted, and a piercing coldness broke out in an instant, turning into an ice wind. Shocking ice layers began to appear in the empty air. Feng Qingwu changed the topic and said softly, your understanding is wrong because of the problem of the timeline. But in fact, time has no meaning. What you experience is only your own timeline. When you put time in a wide enough area, you will find that the so-called present may be the future in another area, and the future may be the past in another area. What you see now is only the past relative to your current timeline. But whether it is the present or the future, that scene has happened. Qin Weibai was in a daze. Why did I dream of this? She asked softly. You are waking up, or in other words, another you is waking up, and you have caused a synchronization in a sense. What is waking up? Feng Qingwu fell silent again. This was obviously a question she could not answer. After waking up, will I see that kind of Tianlan? I am also very awake now, and I would rather not wake up like that. Qin Weibai continued. This is an inevitable process. Feng Qingwu said slowly, it is irreversible. And from our point of view, we all hope that you can speed up your awakening, even if it is for His Majesty. Qin Weibai looked at her quietly, waiting for her explanation. Feng Qingwu was silent for a while and said softly, His Majesty's path has come to an end, and his experience is completely different from that of another you. The current level is already the peak state he can reach. He may be stronger, but it is impossible for him to break through again. Only when you gradually wake up can His Majesty really break through to that supreme realm. Qin Weibai thought for a while, and there was obvious suspicion in her eyes. Xinyuan Wushang didn't tell me this. This is not what he is qualified to know now. Feng Qingwu's tone was light. But in fact, there is nothing wrong with Tianlan's current state. He is only 24 years old. In 10 years or even less, he will definitely break through again and become a real heavenly son. There is no sign that he can't break through, and he doesn't notice it himself. It's not that he can't break through. Feng Qingwu said calmly, he can't break through. Once he takes that step on his own, he'll be discovered. Discovered by who? Qin Weibai's heart suddenly sank. Feng Qingwu moved her body and said softly, do you still remember that story? The other story you experienced, the end of His Majesty. Qin Weibai's body quietly tensed up. That was undoubtedly her biggest secret. How did Feng Qingwu know? That's about it. But in that world, when everything happened, we all paid attention to it. But at that time, things were completely out of control, and we could no longer control the development of things. His Majesty took that step by himself in that world, and the end was already determined. Even if he didn't die under your sword, he would die in other places. Feng Qingwu said. Qin Weibai's face was a little gloomy. You mean, if the current Tianlan breaks through again, he will die? Yes. Feng Qingwu's answer was without any hesitation. Qin Weibai sat on the bed in a daze. After a while, she asked, how do you know what happened in that world? Time is meaningless. Feng Qingwu said something inexplicable and continued to say, and the situation where you are now is a coincidence of time and space paradox. This is also the result of our efforts. In order to achieve this goal, we have paid a very heavy price. Feng Qingwu seemed to say something else. But Qin Weibai could not hear it at all. All her consciousness was attracted by Feng Qingwu's words. To achieve this goal. Forming this paradox. If the existence of two of her was really a kind of time and space paradox, then this was not a coincidence but, created by Feng Qingwu? Was she created by them? Qin Weibai suddenly felt like laughing and crying at the same time. You mean I'm something that you guys created? A machine? It has nothing to do with you. Feng Qingwu shook her head. What we can do is to send you here. And to do all this, we did not create you but to modify time and space and physical constants. You will understand all this, provided that your awakening is smooth enough. Qin Weibai sat there in a daze. After a long time she whispered, "If I wake up successfully, what will happen to Tianlan?" "His Majesty will return." Feng Qingwu's voice was slow, but with unparalleled solemnity and fanaticism. Qin Weibai did not speak. Qin Weibai continued to say, "And what you need to do most is to synchronize your dream with His Majesty's thinking as you imagine. This is the first step for His Majesty to return." "Wake up, return?" Qin Weibai whispered softly. "If I wake up and he returns, will we still be us?" "Of course." Feng Qingwu seemed to be smiling. "In fact, you have woken up partly, but obviously, you do not feel any change in yourself, nor will you become another person." "I have woken up partly?" Qin Weibai was stunned. Feng Qingwu looked at Qin Weibai silently and whispered, "Maybe you don't realize it yourself, but you killed Chen Fangqing." After being stunned for a second, Qin Weibai suddenly reacted. "I didn't do it." "You don't need to do it." Feng Qingwu shook her head. "You have thought about it?" Qin Weibai sat on the bed, hugged her shoulders tightly and shook her head subconsciously. "Who the hell are you?" After a pause, she smiled somewhat self-deprecatingly. "Or are you still human? Gods or demons?" "I am human." Feng Qingwu's tone was a little complicated, with certainty and a little confusion. She was silent for a moment and whispered, "Of course in the eyes of others they call me Dominator." "Of course in the eyes of others they call me Dominator." Qin Weibai did not speak. Her bright eyes were a mess and countless thoughts appeared at the same time. She seemed to be a little confused and a little chaotic. "You don't look very well," Feng Qingwu said. "I'm just a little cold." Qin Weibai replied slowly. "If you need warmth," Feng Qingwu smiled, "I can give it to you." A soft and fluctuating light suddenly bloomed in front of Qin Weibai. Thousands of lights shone. The originally soft light became extremely cold in an instant. Feng Qingwu seemed to be reflecting the cold light of the metal. However, the surrounding air instantly became warm as spring. Time froze in an instant. The light of the metal was slightly refracted. The light shuttled and rushed into space at a speed faster than light. The virtual quantum network base station was instantly formed. Virtual shuttling and leaping in an instant. Feng Qingwu's consciousness went straight into the starry sky through the quantum network base station. The boundless Milky Way formed an incomparably dazzling yet extremely chaotic cosmic curve in her consciousness. The quantum transmission instantly crossed the distance of millions of light-years in the curve of the universe and went straight into the depths of the universe. Silence and dead silence appeared in an instant and disappeared in an instant. The perspective of her consciousness changed for half a second. Feng Qingwu's consciousness entered a large wormhole. The starry sky suddenly retreated. The wormhole shook violently. The boundless black tide seemed to tear the wormhole apart in the blink of an eye. It covered the sky and the earth and rushed directly to Feng Qingwu. It was a sword radiance that tore everything apart. It was crazy, cold, violent, domineering, with extreme excitement and calmness. With an almost invincible determination, the surging sword radiance completely covered Feng Qingwu. Feng Qingwu, whose consciousness was still reflecting the metal sword radiance, stopped for a moment. In the next second, an extremely majestic power instantly exploded in the sea of black sword chi. It was the extreme power of martial arts. The strong shock wave collided with the surging sword chi and the entire wormhole space was shaking violently. Feng Qingwu's movement paused slightly. All the power disappeared completely. In an instant, the boundless black tide seemed to have lost its target. It surged past her and rushed towards the entrance of the wormhole. "Boring," Feng Qingwu said calmly. "Iske?" A voice seemed to be heard in the darkness. The voice came from an extremely far place accompanied by the intense collision sound. It was tough and calm. "You're indeed interesting, Lord. Is this what you're relying on to bully my son?" "I'm only teaching him what he should do," Feng Qingwu said calmly. In a faraway place, a voice that seemed to come from another space directly penetrated the wormhole. It was as hard as iron and carried with it an eerie sharpness. "Perhaps I should also teach you a lesson and let you know what you should do," Feng Qingwu said calmly. "You're fighting against those things now, how are you going to teach me? Based on the amount of sword chi that you can produce, which is not even a billionth of what you had at your peak." Countless sword chi shook violently. The wormhole shattered instantly. It was already a battlefield in front of Feng Qingwu. The voice from afar shattered the wormhole. Instead of bringing Feng Qingwu to her destination, it brought her to the battlefield. "You're the Princess Royal of the space-time corridor. This is where you should be. The black ocean surged and roared in front of Feng Qingwu. The boundless black ocean surged up hundreds of thousands of feet into the sky. The sword radiance whistled and shattered the stars. Countless metallic objects fell into the black ocean. The area of the battlefield was almost calculated in terms of light years. The crazy killing did not stop for even a moment. Countless races, large amounts of metal, the sky was filled with mechas and the dark, enshrouded shadows. Cannons, sword radiance, explosions, lacerations and destruction. The endless number of battleships continued to pour out destructive power. The battlefield was filled with the humans and other races fighting against the dark shadows and mechas. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions, it was vast and mighty, innumerable. Feng Qingwu sighed softly. Her body rose slowly in the void and charged towards her destination. The willpower of the god of war in the black ocean did not stop her this time. Feng Qingwu's speed increased. Boundless radiance shone from her body and became brighter and brighter. At this moment, she seemed to have turned into a shooting star that traversed the battlefield for a few light years. The radiance overflowed rapidly and surpassed the speed of light. With Feng Qingwu as the center, it spread rapidly in all directions. Deception, Genesis. Radiance shot out and stars fell. On the battlefield, the potentials of all the creatures in the neutral camp were instantly stimulated several times. All the heavily injured creatures that had lost their ability to fight were deceived. Everyone thought that they were in their peak condition. They exploded with battle power that exceeded their limits and pounced towards the nearby enemies. The battle power of all the creatures was increasing rapidly. Everyone had been deceived. At this moment, everyone thought that their strength had suddenly made a huge breakthrough. Everyone also showed their strength after the breakthrough. Outside of the neutral camp, all the creatures, be it order or dark shadow, became sluggish. They were also deceived. At this moment they thought that they had been severely injured. Some of the creatures even thought that they had died. The shooting star radiance that Feng Qingwu brought along traversed the entire battlefield. It rose infinitely and exploded instantly. It was as if a gigantic sun had suddenly risen in the dead silent void. The boundless black ocean instantly began to boil. The rays of the sun continued to radiate with lies. In the shortest time possible, it deceived the entire battlefield. This was the pinnacle of the path of deception. It was also the pinnacle leader of the human race on this path. This was the pinnacle of power on the path of deception. This power had a name that was recognized by all the camps. Ruler. Like a sharp sword that tore through the battlefield, with slowly dissipating light, she instantly entered the black hole that had just formed in the battlefield. Deception, Supreme Self. On the battlefield where light and shadow intertwined, an almost supreme will appeared. It was cold, majestic, and irresistible. The moment this willpower appeared, it went against the evil intentions of the world. The black hole that was still taking shape instantly turned into a wormhole. The laws of time and space distorted at a speed visible to the naked eye. Feng Qingwu's body entered the wormhole and appeared tens of thousands of light years away in the blink of an eye. The moment her body entered the black hole, an endless army of the neutral faction rushed out of the same wormhole and joined the battlefield. This was the true ruler. On the battlefield he ruled over everything. The black hole that had just formed was turned into a two-way passageway by Feng Qingwu's lies. It was the same entrance, but there was no difference between entering and exiting. This kind of deception could only last for a few years, but it was enough for the neutral camp to invest billions of soldiers into the battlefield in the next few years. The stars in the sky flickered and retreated rapidly. The newly formed wormhole extended infinitely in Feng Qingwu's consciousness. The darkness only lasted for a moment, but it was already tens of thousands of light years away. It was still the same scene, the same battlefield, the same black ocean, and the same war god Lin Shenyuan. The black ocean formed by the endless sword intense was the most real state of war god Lin Shenyuan, and also his most primitive form of existence. At the start of the war, this ocean surged into the corridor of time and space from the realm of war to the corridor of time and space. For tens of thousands of years, it spread across countless star regions. Everyone in the corridor of time and space agreed that this lunatic was the sharpest lunatic of the human race after His Majesty. The war continued. Even Feng Qingwu did not know how many star regions Lin Xuanyuan's sword aura had passed through and how many enemies of the same level as him had fought. Feng Qingwu did not look at the battlefield and continued to travel. Time and distance seemed to have lost their meaning. She traveled again and again. When Feng Qingwu's consciousness traveled through the wormhole, she suddenly felt a majestic force from the outside world penetrating the wormhole and instantly extending the distance she could travel. Feng Qingwu felt slightly relieved. She knew that she was finally close to her destination. This majestic force was the aura of the War King of the corridor of time and space. In the next second, the silence disappeared completely and there was no more killing. An extremely huge planet appeared in front of Feng Qingwu. This planet rotated slowly, almost occupying all of Feng Qingwu's consciousness. Feng Qingwu was in a trance for a moment. In front of this planet, Miracle City was like a child's toy block in front of a skyscraper. The strong contrast stunned Feng Qingwu, who had already placed all of her attention on Miracle City. She finally reached her destination. This was the capital of the corridor of time and space. Old Capital City. Feng Qingwu took a step forward. Her destination was very clear. Therefore, when she took a step, she deceived the distance between time and space. The chaotic meteorite belt and the atmosphere changed instantly. Feng Qingwu's consciousness had already appeared in an extremely huge palace. The ancient bronze palace was a little mottled and old. Faint lights flickered in every corner of the palace. The space was filled with a clear and ancient aura. In the palace, darkness and light bloomed at the same time and disappeared at the same time. Everything was silent. "Qingwu, what's the matter?" A gentle voice suddenly rang out inside the palace. An extremely gentle golden light suddenly lit up in the deepest part of the palace. Like the rising sun, the golden light shone from afar. The light and darkness in front of her instantly lost all their colors. That golden light instantly became the only thing in the palace. Feng Qingwu floated forward silently for a while. The further she went, the brighter and gentler the golden light became. The light shone on the bronze pillars in the palace, clearly illuminating the countless mottled marks on the bronze pillars. Feng Qingwu arrived at the end of the palace. A gentle golden light shone from the end of the palace. There was an ancient desk there. On the desk there was a thick book that was about the height of a person. It was slowly flipping through the pages. There was no one behind the desk in the book. All the light was above the desk in the book. It was a light that was constantly changing. Sometimes, it was a divine weapon, sometimes, it was a misty cloud. In essence, this tiny and changing speck of light was a drop of blood. There was no corpse or shadow. It was just a drop of blood. Feng Qingwu looked at the drop of blood in front of her. She bowed slightly and said softly, "Greetings, Your Majesty." "What's the matter?" The gentle voice in the golden light was clear and gentle. "I want the million-world portrait." Feng Qingwu answered without any hesitation. Her voice was firm and unquestionable. The majesty in the golden light fell silent for a second. The million-world portrait. One of the most important weapons in the corridor of time and space. It was also one of the 4 most powerful divine weapons in the neutral camp. King Wei million-world portrait, Tower of Human Emperor, Shenyuan sword. Among the 4 divine weapons, the million-world portrait was ranked second. It had never changed in countless reincarnations. If Feng Qingwu was the pinnacle representative of deceit, then the majesty in front of her was the pinnacle of calligraphers and warriors. The million-world portrait was something that the majesty had studied for his entire life. Not only did it contain his calligraphy, but it also contained the calligraphy of every calligrapher in the corridor of time and space. The million-world portrait had existed for thousands of years. Every painting had the ability to split open the sky. Similarly, the million-world portrait was the only divine weapon in the corridor of time and space that could contain the Majesty's drop of blood. Without the million-world portrait, the vitality of the Majesty's drop of blood would gradually dissipate. He would become weaker and weaker until he died. It was destined to be a long time. Unfortunately, time was meaningless. Since there was a possibility of death, the reality of death might appear in the next second. It might be 10,000 years for Feng Qingwu or a minute for the Majesty, sure. A second later, the Majesty's voice was heard. "Which one do you want?" "The Book of Creation." Feng Qingwu seemed a little surprised, but she still answered the Majesty's question quickly. The thick book on the table flipped a few pages and a clear tearing sound was heard in the palace. A thin page fell out of the book and landed in Feng Qingwu's hand. It was as light as a feather. However, the thick book on the table became thinner by about 10%. Streaks of vital energy flew out of the palace and spread into the void. It was the vitality of the Majesty's blood dissipating. Feng Qingwu remained silent for a while and said softly, "Thank you." The Majesty's laughter echoed in the bronze palace. It was carefree and calm. "What? Feng Qingwu couldn't help but ask. The Majesty seemed a little confused. The Book of Creation is very important to you too. Feng Qingwu said, if I'm not wrong, you spent most of your time resting in the Book of Creation. The vitality of your blood overflowed into the Book of Creation and returned to your body. How long could you last without the Book of Creation? Actually, I was mentally prepared for you to reject me because of the corridor of time in the human race. The human race's overall situation, His Majesty whispered to himself and then laughed. His laughter was very soft at first, but then it became louder and louder. However, it was not the kind of hysterical laughter. This laughter was clear, calm, indifferent, open-minded, and finally turned into a faint tiredness. The human clan. What's the big picture? Feng Qingwu was shocked and asked subconsciously, what do you mean? Exactly what I said. The Majesty said calmly, I gave you the Book of Creation because you need it more than I do. Tell me about Her Highness's situation? Her situation is very special. Feng Qingwu was a little uneasy and thought about the Majesty's words. She said subconsciously, in the past few samsara cycles, even if there were returnees, none of them were at the level of the two of them. Their existence can't be replicated. The so-called experience we summarized is only based on the other returnees and the process of your return. In fact, no matter you, me or anyone else, is worthy of being mentioned in the same breath as them. We can't speculate the process of their return. According to my observation, Your Majesty Tianlan has now vaguely come into contact with part of the power of Tianju. This also means that if Your Majesty returns, you will at least reach the 7th level of authority. This is only the most conservative estimate. Tianju, the Majesty pondered and sighed softly. This time, does it start from martial arts? Martial arts has never been for the weak. Feng Qingwu said indifferently, over the years the King of War has lost some competitiveness. You haven't taken any action. Countless people in the corridor of time and space think that the path of martial arts has lost its former glory. But is that really the case? Of course not. The Majesty laughed softly. This is the first path of the human race. Perhaps compared to order and shadow, it has congenital flaws and shortcomings. But I always believe that this path represents true invincibility. Look at Lin Xinyuan and Wang Fuxing. Feng Qingwu said. When His Majesty didn't take action, the two from the God of War realm and the Emperor Palace represented the peak of martial arts in the neutral camp, the God of War. Lin Xinyuan stood at the pinnacle of martial arts and had personally slain the apocalypse of the Order faction. The current God of War was the strongest blade cutting through thorns and thorns for the human race. The most ancient path of martial arts was constantly bursting forth with great vitality in the most chaotic and dangerous situation. Therefore, Feng Qingwu didn't think there was any problem with his path of return. What about Her Highness? His Majesty asked slowly. Feng Qingwu obviously hesitated and said softly, I'm not very sure. But so far she seems to have shown some ability that belongs to Dream, but it is very weak. It is precisely because of this ability that she came into contact with the real imprint that Your Majesty left in the deepest part of her consciousness in order to protect her. I think this should be caused by Her Highness, who is now in hibernation. But we can't detect her situation. We can only detect something from Qin Weibai. This is also what I want to say. Her Highness could survive because of the real imprint that Your Majesty left in the deepest part of her consciousness. That is to say, Your Majesty's real imprint is in Qin Weibai's consciousness. Now Your Majesty has shown an ability similar to the heavenly end. If Her Highness Qin Weibai can further wake up and synchronize her consciousness with Your Majesty's, then His Majesty may come into contact with his real imprint and speed up the pace of return. In that case, when His Majesty returns, he may not be a heavenly end, but... Feng Qingwu paused and said, God of Massacre. His Majesty let out a sigh of relief. With expectation and understanding, he said, so you want the picture of all worlds? Yes. Feng Qingwu said slowly, but I didn't expect you to really give it to me. The topic came back again. His Majesty didn't avoid it this time. He just said softly, it doesn't matter. There is nothing in the space-time corridor that can't be given to them. The big picture. Without the space-time corridor, the so-called big picture is just an illusion. Suddenly, the faint golden light began to brighten. His Majesty's voice became calm and determined. Maybe I should go out for a walk in case the God of War takes all the limelight. Some of the premonitions in his heart became reality. Feng Qingwu's heart slightly sank. You're right. His Majesty said calmly. The golden light began to leave the desk and move forward slowly. Maybe this is the last time we meet. His Majesty's voice was calm and powerful. There will be no miracle. We are about to face another failure. Our doomsday is coming. I'm ashamed to face His Majesty and Her Highness. His Majesty said softly, as the human emperor of the space-time corridor, I have never really completed my mission in the long years. All of us are ashamed to face His Majesty and Her Highness. The human clan has never obtained the right to survive. His Majesty laughed self-deprecatingly. It has never happened. Neutral camp. The god of war dominated the world. The human emperor was calm. The 4 great divine artifacts stabilized the overall situation. In the long years, countless reincarnations, they were destroyed and reborn in the illusion and reality. The human clan was like an ant. They had always been fighting for survival, but they had never obtained the right to survive. What they obtained was just the power to struggle. They tried their best, tried everything, and struggled desperately without compromising. Then they were destroyed and exterminated again and again. Everything must have an end. When I return again, I am still me but also not me. His Majesty looked at Feng Qingwu and said softly, You are still you but also not you. When I return again, maybe I won't be your sister. Whatever it is. His Majesty laughed softly. You should also arrange a way out for yourself. My way out is in the City of Miracles. Feng Qingwu said softly. She had already found a suitable candidate, so she was not afraid of the end of the world. Her smile was even a little happy. I can be his daughter again. The only regret is that I have to change my mother. That should be a good candidate. His Majesty laughed. He looked into the distance, and his gaze seemed to fall on the person who was also called the Human Emperor in the Human Palace, on the God of War who was still slowly struggling in the void, on King Jinjian, on the King of War, and on all the human clan. Everything must have an end. The other party was already here. So he would fall. Feng Qingwu would fall. The God of War would also fall. Everyone's ending had long been destined, and it would come to an end. Let's go. His Majesty said softly. In the Bronze Palace, the golden light instantly bloomed and shot straight into the distant void. Feng Qingwu gently raised her palm. In the extremely distant void, a big hand filled with dark energy and dark matter instantly formed. The world was deceived by lies. The illusory hand slowly moved down and finally enveloped a star that was at its peak. In the next second, the big hand disappeared. The star also disappeared. The endless light and heat were instantly replaced by the cold void. A pearl that was burning with warm light appeared in Feng Qingwu's hand. She picked up the stars with her bare hands. Feng Qingwu calmly held the pearl and slowly put it into the page of the chapter of creation in her other hand. The yellowed page instantly became warm and shone with a soft light. The soft light gently fluctuated, and Feng Qingwu's figure disappeared. Only the Bronze Palace was left. It was silent, dead and empty, as if it had existed since ancient times without any vitality. Feng Qingwu opened her eyes again. In her sight was the wind and snow outside the hotel. It was Qin Weibai, who was quietly hugging her snow-white shoulders on the bed. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.